The FBI's Secret War on Political Freedom. By Nelson Blackstock with an introduction by Noam Chomsky. Contents. 1. Prevent these people from getting elected. 39. 2. Inciting violence. It should be an interesting experience for Mr. Halstead. 55. 3. Targeting a black candidate. Determine if there is anything derogatory in his background. 65. 4. A special hatred for blacks. 83. 5. Drive a wedge between the followers of Malcolm X and the SWP. 101. 6. Cause disruption in the peace movement. 111. 7. Red baiting. 137. 8. Firing teachers. The children and the country deserve to be protected. 161. 9. The fight to stop Cointelpro goes before the public. 181. Preface. By Nelson Blackstock. Much of what is publicly known today about the FBF's Cointelpro, counterintelligence program, operations is the result of evidence forced to light through a lawsuit brought by the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance against FBI spying, harassment, and disruption. The suit was filed in 1973. Most of the FBI documents reproduced in this book were obtained in 1974 and 1975 through the SWP lawsuit. These papers and the Cointelpro operations provided not only an unprecedented look at some of the surreptitious methods used by the secret police. They also offered, despite their authors' original intentions, pieces of the history of the efforts to build the communist movement in the United States. From pages of FBI files that were never intended for public viewing came information about the participation of the SWP and YSA in the struggle for black rights and fights against police. FRAMEUPSOF working class leaders, details about the contributions of SWP leaders such as Fred Halstead in labor struggles and the movement against the Vietnam War, and facts about the collaboration of communist leaders such as Clifton WRRY with Malcolm X and his followers in the organization of Afro-American Unity. I was a staff writer for The Militant, a socialist news weekly published in New York, when these files came to light. I was given the assignment of preparing a series of articles that would utilize the Cointelpro papers to tell some of the history of the SWP and the individuals who were victimized by the government because of their contribution to the leadership of working class battles. The articles originally appeared in The Militant in 1975. Later that year they were published, together with an introduction by Noam Chomsky, by Pathfinder. In 1976 Vintage Books brought out another edition. The icon for reissuing this volume now, which is a reprint of the 1975 Pathfinder edition, is the final and successful completion of the SWP and YSA lawsuit. U.S. District Judge Thomas Gryza ultimately ruled against the FBI. The judge concluded that the FBI's actions, including Cointelpro, constituted violations of the constitutional rights of the SWP and lacked legislative or regulatory authority. With specific reference to Cointelpro operations detailed in the present volume, Gryza found, there can be no doubt that these eruptive operations were patently unconstitutional and violated the SWP's First Amendment rights of free speech and assembly. Moreover, there was no statutory or regulatory authority to disrupt the SWP's legal activities. Gryza also ruled that the very presence of undercover FBI informers masquerading as members was in violation of the constitutional right to privacy of the SWP and YSA and of their individual members and supporters. The judge issued a permanent injunction against any use of information obtained by the FBI in violation of the rights of the SWP and YSA. And he ordered the government to pay $264,000 in damages to the two organizations. In March 1988, the Justice Department withdrew its appeal of Gryza's ruling, making the decision final. The story of the victory in the case is told in a companion volume, FBI on Trial, edited by Margaret Jaco. It includes the complete text of Judge Gryza's decision together with other material on the case. A further contribution to understanding the historic achievement represented by the SWP and YSA case is Washington's 50-year domestic Contra operation, by Lars Siegel. Siegel's essay explains why the SWP and YSA were able to take the initiative in the fight against FBI disruption and spying, and why they were able to follow the fight through to its successful conclusion. It is available in the Marxist magazine New International, issue number 6, and in the Spanish-language pamphlet 50 Años de Guerra Encubierta, el FBI contra los Derechos Democráticos. A measure of the changes in political consciousness in the years since Cointelpro was exposed was the public outrage that greeted the release of FBI documents detailing the agency's undercover spy operation against the committee in solidarity with the people of El Salvador, CISPs. The sharp reaction to this spy campaign was a product of the change in awareness brought about by the SWP suit and other initiatives against the FBI, including the Cointelpro revelations. The notion that people have the right to freedom of speech and asociación, without their privacy being violated by snoops and finks, is one that is more dearly held by far broader layers of the population than ever before. Beginning in the fall of 1971, some curious events took place in Detroit, Michigan. In late October, lists of supporters, contributors, and subscribers to the party newspaper were stolen from the campaign headquarters of the Michigan Socialist Workers' Party. A few months later, the home of a Socialist Workers' Party organizer was robbed. Valuables were ignored, but membership lists and internal party bulletins were stolen. The burglaries remain unsolved. If we ask who might be interested in obtaining the stolen material, a plausible hypothesis suggests itself. The natural hypothesis gains support from the fact that persons whose names appeared on the stolen lists were then contacted and harassed by FBI agents, and a personal letter of resignation from the party, apparently stolen from the headquarters, was transmitted by the FBI to the Civil Service Commission. Information that has since been obtained about FBI activities, including burglaries over many years, lends further substantiation to the conclusion that the FBI was engaged in one of its multifarious endeavors to undermine and disrupt activities that fall beyond the narrow bounds of the established political consensus. The Detroit events recall another incident which, with its aftermath, became the major news story of 1974. But it would be misleading to compare the Detroit burglaries to the Watergate caper. If, indeed, the FBI was responsible, as seems most likely, then the Detroit burglaries are a far more serious matter. If the conclusion is correct, then in Detroit it was the political police of the national government which, in their official function, were engaged in disrupting the sanctity of the democratic process. 9. Not merely a gang of bunglers working outside the item. The outing of Richard Nixon for high misdeeds were described in the nation's press as a stunning vindication of our constitutional system. 1. The Detroit example, and others far more serious to which I return, suggest a rather different reaction. There is a fundamental distinction between Watergate and Detroit. In the case of the events surrounding Watergate, the victims were men of power who are expected to share in the ruling of society and the formation of ideology. In Detroit the victims were outsiders, fair game for political repression of a sort that is quite normal. Thus it is true, in a sense, that the punishment of Nixon and his cohorts was a vindication of our system, i.e. the system actually operates in practice. The Nixon gang had broken the rules, directing against the political center a minor variant of the techniques of repression that are commonly applied against radical dissent. If the basic work of repression continues, after Nixon, without appreciable comment or concern, then this too will show that the system is functioning quite in accord with ample historical precedent. Assuming FBI involvement, the Detroit incident is nevertheless minor in comparison with other facts exposed during the several years. From December 1973, the government was compelled through several civil suits to release documentary evidence concerning its various campaigns to undermine and disrupt legal activities direct to social change or simply protest against state policy, through the decade of the 1960s. In comparison with these revelations, the whole Watergate affair was a Tea Party. The documents and depositions made public during this period, and revelations by disaffected government agents, lay bare a systematic and extensive program of terror, disruption, intimidation, and instigation of violence, initiated under the most liberal Democratic administrations and carried further under Nixon. The Department of Justice, in its apologetic and fragmentary review, asserts that the counterintelligence program, Cointelpro, operations were apparently not reported to any of the attorneys general in office during the periods in which they were implemented, apart from certain aspects of the Bureau's efforts to penetrate and disrupt the Communist Party USA and white hate groups. 2. Assuming this assertion to be true, we may still observe that government officials who had even a passing familiarity with FBI practices in the past had a definite responsibility to determine how the Bureau was acting, under their authority. A review of these programs demonstrates the relative insignificance of the charges raised against Nixon and his associates, specifically, the charges presented in the congressional articles of impeachment. 3. Further insight into the state of American society can be derived by the following simple exercise: compare the attention focused on the Watergate episodes by the mass media, including the liberal press and journals of opinion, with the reaction to the exposures, during exactly the same period, of the FBI programs. This exercise will demonstrate that until the dust had settled over Watergate, there was virtually no mention of the government programs of violence and disruption or comment concerning them, and even after the Watergate affair was successfully concluded, there has been only occasional discussion. The New Republic, which at that time could fairly be considered the semi-official organ of American liberalism, was unconcerned by these exposures, though hardly an issue passed without a denunciation of Nixon for his crimes, trivial by comparison. With a few honorable exceptions, specifically, The Nation, the same was true more generally. The Watergate affair thus reveals quite clearly the subservience of the media to power and official ideology. The example is a particularly telling one, given that the media are so commonly hailed for their courage and independence during this period. The lesson of Watergate is simple. American liberalism and the corporate media will defend themselves against attack. But their spirited acts of self-defense are not to be construed as a commitment to civil liberties or democratic principle, despite noble and self-serving rhetoric. Quite the contrary. They demonstrate a commitment to the principle that power must not be threatened or injured. The narrow elites that control the economy, political life, and the system of conventional doctrine must be immune to the means of harassment that are restricted, in the normal course of events, to those who raise a serious challenge to ruling ideology or state policy or established privilege. An enemies list that includes major corporate leaders, media figures, and government intellectuals is an obscenity that is seen as shaking the foundations of the Republic. The involvement of the National Political Police in the assassination of Black Panther leaders, however, barely deserves comment in the national press, including the liberal press and journals, with rare exceptions. The Cointelpro operations of the 1960s were modeled on the successful programs of earlier years undertaken to disrupt the American Communist Party. Though details are unknown, these programs were no secret, and were generally regarded as legitimate. The program's dire against the Communist Party continued through the 1960s and, with such interesting innovations as Operation Hoodwink from 1966 through mid-1968, designed to incite organized crime against the Communist Party through documents fabricated by the FBI, evidently in the hope that criminal elements would carry on the work of repression and disruption in their own manner, by means that may be left to the imagination. From the evidence now available, it appears that the first FBI disruption program, apart from the CP, was launched in August 1960 against groups advocating independence for Puerto Rico. In October 1961, the SWP disruption program was put into operation against the Socialist Workers' Party. The grounds offered, in a secret FBI memorandum, were the following: the party had been openly espousing its line on a local and national basis through running candidates for public office and strongly directing and/or supporting such causes as Castro's Cuba and integration problems, in the South. The SWP disruption program, put into operation during the Kennedy administration, reveals very clearly the FBI's understanding of its function, to block legal political activity that departs from orthodoxy, to disrupt opposition to state policy, to undermine the civil rights movement. These basic commitments were pursued in subsequent years. For example, the Phoenix office of the FBI noted in a memorandum of October 1, 1968, that Professor Morris Starsky of Arizona State University, by his actions, has continued to spotlight himself as a target for counterintelligence action. These actions consisted of the following crimes against the state. He and his wife were both named as presidential electors by and for the Socialist Workers' Party when the SWP in August 1968 gained a place on the ballot in Arizona. In addition, they have sisted themselves as treasurer and secretary respectively of the Arizona SWP. Nothing further is alleged, though an earlier memorandum, May 31, 1968, identifies Starsky as one of those who have provided inspiration and leadership for new left organizations and activities in the Phoenix metropolitan area, so that he is one of the most logical targets for potential counterintelligence action. The memorandum suggests that reliable and cooperative contacts in the mass media should be helpful in this particular program of disruption of the New Left. The documents in the Starsky case also indicate that prior to the targeting of Starsky on October 1, the FBI had somehow influenced the Board of Regents that controls the university to find cause to separate Professor Starsky from the public payroll on trumped-up charges, Memorandum of July L. 1968. Similarly, the comprehensive program to expose, disrupt, and otherwise neutralize the activities of the various New Left organizations, their leadership and adherents, secretly put into operation in May 1968, was motivated by the fact that New Left activists urge revolution, are responsible for unspecified violence and disruption, call for the defeat of the United States in Vietnam, and continually and falsely allege police brutality and do not hesitate to utilize unlawful acts to further their so-called causes. They have even on many occasions viciously and scurrilously attacked the director and the bureau in an attempt to hamper our investigation of it and to drive us off the college campuses, where, naturally, the state's political police should be free to operate with impunity. The latter offense was particularly grave since, as is now known, FBI provocateurs were engaged in extensive efforts throughout the country to instigate campus violence, disrupt student groups, eliminate radical faculty, and the like, and FBI agents were, for example, engaged in such actions as stealing documents from campus groups and burglarizing the offices of professors supporting them. 5. The commitment of the FBI to undermine the civil rights movement, despite an elaborate pretense to the contrary, and even some actions as government policy vacillated on the issue, will come as no surprise to people with first-hand experience in the South in the early 1960s. As late as summer 1965, FBI observers refused to act within their legal authority to protect civil rights demonstrators who were being savagely beaten by police and thrown into stockades. Some, who tried to find sanctuary on federal property, were thrown from the steps of the federal building in Jackson, Mississippi, by federal marshals. These efforts continued in later years, as, for example, when the FBI, under Cointelpro, succeeded in driving a black minister from the Jackson Human Rights Project in early 1969, causing him to leave the South altogether, by sending him a spurious, threatening letter and encouraging school and church officials to file complaints against him on the basis of charges which, according to his ACLU lawyer, were fabricated by the Bureau and derogatory information provided by the Bureau. 6. Predictably, the most serious of the FBI disruption programs were those directed against black nationalists. These programs, also initiated under liberal Democratic administrations, had as their purpose to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalist, hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder. Agents were instructed to inspire action in instances where circumstances warrant. Specifically, they were to undertake actions to discredit these groups both within the responsible Negro community and to Negro radicals, and also to the white community, both the responsible community and to liberals who have vestiges of sympathy for militant black nationalists simply because they are Negro. Several model actions were proposed to agents, who were instructed to take an enthusiastic and imaginative approach to this new counterintelligence endeavor, including an action apparently directed against the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in 1967, in which local police, alerted by the FBI, arrested leaders on every possible charge until they could no longer make bail, so that they spent most of the summer in jail and no violence traceable to censored took place. In this case too, agents were directed to use established local news media contacts and other sources available to the seat of government to disrupt or neutralize these organizations and to ridicule and discredit them. In the light of these documents, one cannot fail to recall the elaborate subsequent campaign, in this case abetted by several liberal intellectuals and democratic socialists, to ridicule and discredit individuals who attempted to raise funds for the Black Panthers during the period when they were being subjected to extensive police and judicial attack. During these years, FBI provocateurs repeatedly urged and initiated violent acts, including forceful disruption of meetings and demonstrations on and off university campuses, attacks on police, bombings, and so on. Meanwhile, government agencies financed, helped organize, and supplied arms to right-wing terrorist groups that carried out firebombings, burglaries, and shootings, all with the knowledge of the government agencies responsible. 7. In most cases the FBI, although on right-wing I. 15. Terrorist in Chicago claims that his group was financed and directed in part by the CIA. 8. One FBI provocateur resigned when he was asked to arrange the bombing of a bridge in such a way that the person who placed the booby-trapped bomb would be killed. This was in Seattle, where it was revealed that FBI infiltrators had been engaged in a campaign of arson, terrorism, and bombings of university and civic buildings, and where the FBI arranged a robbery, entrapping a young black man who was paid $75 for the job and killed in a police ambush. 9. In another case, an undercover operative who had formed and headed a pro-communist Chinese organization at the direction of the Bureau reports further that at the Miami Republican Convention he incited peopletum over one of the buses and then told them that if they really wanted to blow the bus up, to stick a rag in the gas tank and light it, they were unable to overturn the vehicle. The same ex-operative contends that Cointelpro type operations, allegedly suspended in April 1971, were in fact continuing as late as mid-1974, when he left the Bureau's employ. Many details are now available concerning the extensive campaign of terror and disruption waged by the government during these years, in part through right-wing paramilitary groups organized and financed by the national government but primarily through the much more effective means of infiltration and provocation. In particular, much of the violence on campus can be attributed to government provocateurs. To cite a few examples, the Alabama branch of the ACLU argued in court that in May 1970 an FBI agent committed arson and other violence that police used as a reason for declaring that university students were unlawfully assembled. 11. -150 students were arrested. The court ruled that the agent's role was irrelevant unless the defense could establish that he was instructed to commit the violent acts, but this was impossible, according to defense counsel, since the FBI and police thwarted his efforts to locate the agent who had admitted the acts to him. William Frappoli, who surfaced as a government informer in the Chicago 8 conspiracy trial, an active member of student and off-campus peace groups in Chicago, during an anti-war rally at his college, grabbed the microphone from the college president and wrestled him off the stage and worked out a scheme for wrecking the toilets in the college dorms, as an act of anti-war protest. 12. Many such cases have been exposed throughout the country. Perhaps the most shocking story concerns the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. BY Chicago police directed BYTHE State's Attorney's Office in December 1969, in a pre-dawn raid on a Chicago apartment. Hampton, one of the most promising leaders of the Black Panther Party, particularly dangerous because of his opposition to violent acts or rhetoric and his success in community organizing, was killed in bed, perhaps drugged. Depositions in a civil suit in Chicago reveal that the chief of Panther security and Hampton's personal bodyguard, William O'Neill, was an FBI infiltrator. O'Neill gave his FBI contacting agent, Roy Mitchell, a detailed floor plan of the apartment, which Mitchell turned over to the state's attorney's office shortly before the attack, along with information of dubious veracity that there were 2 illegal shotguns in the apartment. For his services, O'Neill was paid over $10,000 from January 1969 through July 1970, according to Mitchell's affidavit. The availability of the floor plan presumably explains why all the police gunfire went to the inside comers of the apartment, rather than toward the entrances, and undermines still further the pretense by the police that the police barrage was caused by confusion in unfamiliar surroundings that led them to believe, falsely, that they were being fired upon by the Panthers inside. 13. Agent Mitchell was named by the Chicago Tribune as head of the Chicago Cointelpro directed against the Black Panthers and other black groups. Whether or not this is true, there is now substantial evidence of direct FBI involvement in this Gestapo-style political assassination. O'Neill, incidentally, continued to report to Mitchell after the raid. He was taking part in meetings with the Hampton family and discussions between lawyers and clients, one of many such examples of violation of the lawyer-client relation. To cite another, which did receive considerable publicity, the chief security officer of the American Indian Movement, also a paid FBI informer, was the only person, other than defendants and lawyers, with regular access to the room in which defense strategy was planned. So valuable were his services during this period that his cash payment from the Bureau was raised from $900 to $1,100 a month. The government, in a sworn affidavit at the trial, had appeared to contend that it had no informer in THE defense ranks. The informer, who came to believe that AIM was, in his words, a legal, social organization that wasn't doing anything wrong, reports also that he helped lead an armed take over a state office building in Iowa, among other tasks performed for the FBI. 1. A top-secret special report for the president in June 1971 gives EOMI insight into the motivation for the actions undertaken by the government to destroy the Black Panther Party. The report describes the party the most active and dangerous black extremist group in the United States. Its hardcore members were estimated at about 800, but a recent poll indicates that approximately 25% of the black population had great respect for the BPP, including 43% of blacks under 21 years of age. And the B of Yukaidamati of the potential of the party, the repressive agencies of the state proceed against it to ensure that it did not succeed in organizing a potential social or political force. We may add that in Thikai, government repression proved quite useful. The EAM special report develops the broader motivation for the FBI operations. The intelligence analysis explains that the movement of rebellious youth known as the New Left, involving and influencing a potential number of college students, is having a serious impact on contemporary society with a potential for serious domestic strife. The New Left had a revolutionary aim and an identification with Marxism-Leninism. It had attempted to infiltrate and radicalize labor, and after failing to subvert and control the media had established a large network of underground publications which serve the dual purpose of an internal communication network and an external propaganda organ. Its leaders have openly stated their sympathy with the international communist revolutionary movements in South Vietnam and Cuba, and have directed others into activity which support these movements. Although New Left groups have been responsible for widespread damage to ROTC facilities, for the halting of EOMI weaponry-related research, and for the increasing dint within the military Irvisi, the major threat to the internal security of the United States, i.e. that direct against the civilian sector of our society. In summary, during the decade of the 19,608 and for a period of unknown duration since, perhaps still continuing, the FBI extended its earlier clandestine operations against the Communist Party, committing its rearse to undermining the Puerto Rico independence movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Civil Rights Movement, Black nationalist movements, the Ku Klux 18 Klan, segments of the peace movement, the student movement, and the New Left in general. The overall allocation of FBI resources during this period is of course unknown. One relevant bit of evidence is provided by the media files, stolen from the Media Pennsylvania office of the FBI in March 1971 by a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, and widely distributed through left and peace movement channels. According to its analysis of the documents in this FBI office, 1% were devoted to organized crime, mostly gambling, 30% were manuals, routine forms, and similar procedural matter, 40% were devoted to political surveillance and the like, including 2 cases involving right-wing groups, 10 concerning immigrants, and over 200 on left or liberal groups. Another 14% of the documents concerned draft resistance and leaving the military without government permission. The remainder concerned bank robberies, murder, rape, and interstate theft. 16. Whether these figures are typical or not we cannot know, in the case of a secret organization like the FBI. It is clear, however, that the commitment of the FBI to undermine and destroy popular movements that departed from political orthodoxy was extensive, and was apparently proportional to the strength and promise of such movements as one would expect in the case of the secret police organization of any state, though it is doubtful that there is anything comparable to this record among the Western industrial democracies. The effectiveness of the state disruption programs is not easy to evaluate. Surely it was not a light. Black leaders estimate the significance of the programs as substantial. Dr. James Turner of Cornell University, president of the African Heritage Studies Association, AAAEAEA, these programs as having serious long-term consequences for Black Americans, in that they had created in blacks a sense of depression and hopelessness. 17. He states that the FBI set out to break the momentum developed in black communities in the late 50s and early 60s. We needed to put together organizational mechanisms to deliver services, but instead, our ability to influence things that happen to us internally and externally was killed. He concludes that the lack of confidence and paranoia stimulated among black people by these actions were just beginning to fade. Conceivably, the long-term impact may be salutary. We realize that we can't depend on symbolism and on inspired leadership, and we are beginning to build solidly bad organizations. Symbolism and inspired leadership are easy targets for the repressive institutions of the state, its propaganda agencies, and cooperative intellectuals. Solidly based organizations may be able to withstand such attacks. The same lesson, of course, must be learned outside the black community. We note further that the criminal activities of the FBI were initiated under the liberal Democratic administrations and carried further under Nixon. These programs were, partially, exposed during the Watergate period, and though incomparably more serious than anything charged against Nixon, they were virtually ignored during this period by the liberal national press and journals of opinion, and only marginally discussed since, though ample information is available. I have discovered personally, and others may verify for themselves, that much of the most significant information is unknown to generally well-informed journalists and other intellectuals, and that the scale of the FBI programs is rarely appreciated, though by now enough information is readily available for those who want to know. We note finally that the Justice Department has decided not to prosecute anyone in connection with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's 15-year campaign to disrupt the activities of suspected subversive organizations. 18. J. Stanley Pottinger, head of the Civil Rights Division, reported to the Attorney General that HE had found no basis for criminal charge data against any particular individuals involving particular incidents. The present director of the FBI has also made clear that he sees nothing particularly serious in the revelations of the past several years. There will be no congressional committee conducting a serious investigation of these practices, and no furor in the liberal press over the revelations themselves or the failure to investigate them. In short, the system continues to work. The criminal programs of the FBI during the 1960s are simply an extension of past practices. According to William C. Sullivan, Hoover's assistant for many years. Such a very great man as Franklin D. Roosevelt saw nothing wrong in asking the FBI to investigate those opposing his Lend-Lease policy, a purely political request. He also had us look into the activities of others who opposed our entrance into World War II, just as later administrations had the FBI look into those opposing the conflict in Vietnam. It was a political request also when Roosevelt instructed us to put a telephone tap, a microphone, and a physical surveillance on an internationally known leader in his administration. It was done. The realta he wanted were secured and given to him. Certain records of this kind were not then or later put into the regular FBI filing system. Rather, they were deliberately kept out of it. 19. Not long after World War II ended, President Truman put into operation the repressive measures which laid the basis for what is misleadingly called McCarthyism. The MUNDT, Nixon bill calling for the registration of the Communist Party was reported out of Nixon's House Committee on Un-American Activities in 1948. Senate liberals objected, and after a Truman veto they proposed as a substitute the ultimate weapon of repression, concentration camps to intern potential troublemakers on the occasion of some loosely defined future internal security emergency, 20 including, as one case, insurrection within the United States in aid of a foreign enemy. 21. This substitute was advocated by Benton, Douglas, Graham, Kefauver, Kilgore, Lehman, and Humphrey, then a freshman senator. Humphrey later voted against the bill, though he did not retreat from his concentration camp proposal. In fact, he was concerned that the conference committee had brought back a weaker bill, not a bill to strike stronger blows at the communist menace, but weaker blows. The problem with the new bill was that those interned in the detention centers would have the right of habeas corpus so they can be released and go on to their dirty business. 22 Humphrey complained. In later years as well Senate liberals were responsible for some of the most repressive legislation. During the same period, the ideological institutions of American society, the mass media, cinema, and the universities and schools were successfully purified as radicals were largely eliminated from the sensitive professions and often harassed or dismissed elsewhere as well. It was only under the pressure of the student movement in the late 1960s that the universities were compelled to become slightly less orthodox and to make marginal concessions to freedom of thought and inquiry that moved beyond the ideological consensus determined by ruling groups. And even in those years, in numerous cases radicals were forced out of academic positions, often by faculty or administration decision, but in some instances over the heads of faculty and administrators, by the governing bodies of the universities. It is now commonly argued that during the late 1960s the universities were virtually taken over by the left, while the mass media took on an adversary position with respect to state authority, some say irreparably, while others laud the press for its honesty and independence. This is gross nonsense. The orthodoxy of the universities was barely challenged. Overwhelmingly, university departments, particularly those concerned with domestic policy and international affairs, remained under the control of people committed to the reigning state capitalist ideology, and throughout the Vietnam War the subversion of the universities and the service of state policy persisted with only minor interference. As for the media, I have already pointed out that the Watergate affair, allegedly their finest hour, merely demonstrates their continued subservience to the ruling powers. The same is generally true with regard to the war in Vietnam. Even the liberal press generally continued, to the end, to describe the war as a conflict between North and South Vietnam, hewing close to the official propaganda line. Media doves joined most liberal intellectuals in protesting that the United States was defending South Vietnam in an exercise of misplaced benevolence. The war was a mistake, a case of good motives transmuted, mysteriously, into bad policy, with no one to blame. The fact that the United States was engaged in direct aggression in South Vietnam, and that its murderous attack against the rural society of South Vietnam then spilled over to neighboring regions, has been consistently suppressed by the media and journals of opinion, again with a few honorable exceptions. The war in Laos and Cambodia was kept secret over long periods through the self-censorship of the press, which then hypocritically blamed Nixon for deception when the time came to punish him for his departure from the established rules of the game. Kissinger's efforts to evade the provisions of the peace treaty were effectively kept from public attention, in a remarkable display of submissiveness. I have given elaborate documentation elsewhere, and will not discuss this matter further here. 2. When someone suggests a reduction in military spending or the cancellation of some new superweapon development, outraged apologists for militarism are sure to denounce such proposals for unilateral disarmament. Similarly, a slight breach in orthodoxy is sufficient to terrify authoritarian ideologues, who see in it the collapse of the system of thought control that has been so effective in depoliticizing American society. The gross exaggerations of frightened academics and political commentators serve to illustrate the extent and success of the long-standing system of ideological control in the United States. I have spoken of this system as a post-World War II phenomenon, but that is a mistake. Its roots go far deeper. Recall that J. Edgar Hoover rose to national prominence when he was appointed chief of the General Intelligence, Anti-Radical Division of the Justice Department in August 1919, just before the Palmer raids of January 2, 1920, when more than 4,000 alleged radicals were rounded up in 33 cities in TWENTY-3 states. Over 200 aliens were subsequently deported, while the Washington Post editorialized that there is no time to waste on hair-splitting over infringement of liberty in the face of the Bolshevik menace, and lauded the House of Representatives for its expulsion of Socialist Congressman Victor Berger on grounds that it could not have given a finer or more impressive demonstration of Americanism. The New York Times meanwhile described the expulsion of Socialist Assemblymen as an American vote altogether, a patriotic and conservative vote which an immense majority of the American people will approve and sanction, whatever the benighted electorate may believe. 2. One may trace the pattern back much further, to the Alien and Sedition Acts by which the Federalists sought to suppress political opposition and to stamp out lingering sympathy for the principles of the French Revolution. 25 or the judicial murder of 4 anarchists for having advocated doctrines which allegedly lay behind the explosion of a bomb in Chicago's High Market Square after a striker had been killed by police in May 1886. 26. The Cointelpro documents and the related disclosures are noteworthy, and in accord with historical precedent, in that no specific illegal acts were charged against those targeted by the FBI, though a vague propensity for violence and unspecified violent acts are all alleged. Similarly, the seditious utterances of the High Market anarchists sufficed, in the eyes of the Chicago police, to attribute moral responsibility for the bombing and to justify their prosecution and hanging. 27. And Attorney General Palmer justified his actions to clean up the country almost unaided by any virile legislation on grounds of the failure of Congress to stamp out these seditious societies and their open defiance of law by various forms of propaganda. Upon these two basic certainties, first that the Reds were criminal aliens, and secondly that the American government must prevent crime, it was decided that there could be no nice distinctions drawn between the theoretical ideals of the radicals and their actual violations of our national laws. Palmer's information showed that communism in this country was an organization of thousands of allied, who were direct allies of Trotsky. Thus the government is now sweeping the nation clean of such alien filth, with the overwhelming support of the press, until they perceived that their own interests were threatened. 28 Elsewhere he described the prisoners as follows. Out of the sly and crafty eyes of many of them leap cupidity, cruelty, insanity, and crime. From their lopsided faces, sloping brows, and miohapan features may be recognized the unmistakable criminal type. Palmer was a liberal and progressive. His purpose was to tear out the radical seeds that have entangled American ideas in their poisonous theories. 30 His belief that the state has the authority to prevent these seeds from germinating is within the general framework of American liberalism. The mass media, the schools, and the universities defend ideological orthodoxy in their own, generally successful, ways. When a threat to reigning dogma is perceived, the state is entitled to act. After World War I, labor militancy menaced established privilege. Hoover labored to portray the 1919 steel strike as a red conspiracy. A subsequent miners' strike was described by President Wilson as one of the gravest steps ever proposed in this country, a grave moral and legal wrong, while the press warned that the miners, red-soaked in the doctrines of Bolshevism, were starting a general revolution in America. 1. The Red Scare, as Levin shows, was promoted, in large part, by major business groups which feared their power was threatened by a leftward trend in the labor movement, and they had reason to rejoice at its substantial success, namely, to weaken and conservatize the labor movement, to dismantle radical parties, and to intimidate liberals. It was an attempt largely successful to reaffirm the legitimacy of the power elites of capitalism and to further weaken workers' class consciousness. The Red Scare was strongly backed by the press and the American elites until they came to see that their own interests would be harmed as the right-wing frenzy got out of hand, in particular, the anti-immigrant hysteria, which threatened the best reserve of cheap labor. The Red Scare also served to buttress an interventionist foreign policy. Foster Rea Dulles observed that governmental agencies 33 made most of these fears and kept up a barrage of anti-Bolshevik propaganda throughout 1919, which was at least partially inspired by the need to justify the policy of intervention in both Archangel and Siberia. 32. After World War II, the story was reenacted. While intellectual ideologists depicted American expansionism as defense of freedom, with an occasional, but understandable excess of zeal, transmuting the brutal Russian state into a global aggressor under an elaborate mythology that even its creators have been compelled to disown, the state moved to ensure obedience and submissiveness to the evolving imperial system and the domestic permanent war economy. As already noted, American liberals had their hand in some of the worst abuses. The general motivation was the traditional one: there could be no nice distinctions drawn between the theoretical ideals of the radicals and their actual violations of our national laws. Palmer. The basic liberal doctrine was laid out clearly by Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson in his opinion upholding the Smith Act on grounds that it was no violation of free speech to convict communists for conspiring to teach or advocate the forcible overthrow of the government, even if no clear and present danger could be proved. For if the clear and present danger test were applied, Jackson argued, it means that communist plotting is protected during its period of incubation, its preliminary stages of organization and preparation are immune from the law, the government can move only after imminent action is manifest, when it would, of course, be too late. Thus there must be some legal formula that will secure an existing order against revolutionary radicalism. There is no constitutional right to gang up on the government. Opposition tendencies, however minuscule, must be nipped in the bud prior to imminent action. As for the Communist Party, ordinary conspiracy principles suffice to charge any individual associated with it with responsibility for and participation in all that makes up the party's program, and even an individual, acting alone and apart from any conspiracy, cannot claim that the Constitution protects him in advocating or teaching overthrow of government by force or violence. 3. In conformity with these doctrines, the ideological institutions must be kept free of contamination. Even a single tenured Marxist professor of economics in a country as complex and Diverse as the United States constitutes a potential threat. As in the case of the Red Scare of 1920, it was only when the hysteria that had been whipped up began to endanger major institutions and individuals near the center of power that the economic and political leadership and their intellectual spokesmen took effective measures to terminate the repression, or more accurately, to restrict it to the proper victims. Given the historical context, it is entirely natural that the beginnings of the ferment of protest and organization in the early 1960s set the apparatus of repression into operation once again, in the manner described in the documents presented below and elsewhere. Nor is it surprising that American liberalism looked the other way, until the repression struck home under Nixon, and even then, it is important to emphasize once again, indignation was largely restricted to Nixon's crimes, insignificant in comparison to the revelations of the same period. Matters are no different when the black anarchist Martin Soster designated as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International as Merci Leslie persecuted by the state, or when black students are murdered at Orangeburg and Jackson State, and on. Some commentators have found it puzzling that the FBI should devote such energies to hounding a scoutmaster in Orange, New Jersey, whose wife is a socialist, or to disrupting small socialist parties, while crime rates in American cities escalated and organized crime expanded. Its interests and the real espionage dangers from the Soviet KGB were apparently ignored. 34. Placing the events in their historical and doctrinal context, the puzzle is easily resolved. The real threat to the existing order is not organized crime or the KGB, but revolutionary radicalism or even protest by popular groups that have escaped the control of the political leadership and intellectual ideologists. That this threat can quickly become real indeed was made evident in the late 1960s and, when American aggression in Vietnam was significantly hampered. 35 and its ideological props swept away, in significant circles, though not in the major ideological institutions. For the most part, however, the threat of intellectual independence and uncontrolled political and social organization has been well contained, the major post-war success of the containment policy. Alone among the parliamentary democracies, the United States has had no mass-based socialist party, however mild and reformist, no socialist voice in the media, and virtually no departure from centrist ideology within the schools and universities, at least until the pressure of student activism impelled a slight departure from orthodoxy. All of this is testimony to the effectiveness of the system of controls that has been in force for many years, the activities of the FBI being only the spearhead for far more extensive, substantial, and effective if more low-keyed measures enforced throughout American society. From its inception, the FBI has operated on the liberal doctrine that preliminary stages of organization and preparation must be frustrated, well before there is any clear and present danger of revolutionary radicalism, occasionally progressing beyond the intended bounds of this doctrine. The people of the United States pay dearly for domestic privilege and the securing of imperial domains. The vast waste of social wealth, miserable urban ghettos, meaningless work within authoritarian capitalist institutions, the threat, or reality, of lose even the opportunity to rent oneself to the owners of capital, standards of health and social welfare that should be intolerable in a society with vast productive resources. All of this must be endured and even welcomed as the price of freedom if the existing order is to stand without challenge. The intelligentsia have generally played their natural role, promulgating the required doctrines with enthusiasm and energy and diverting or diluting any serious departure from the conventional system of beliefs, with an occasional show of dismay when privileged groups themselves are threatened. As for the state instruments of repression, one can expect little change in coming years, at least until the rise of mass-based popular organizations devoted to social change and to an end of oppression and injustice. Notes. Noam Chomsky. July 1975. 1. Prevent these people from getting elected. In late 1971, Donald Segretti was discharged from the Army, where he had served as an attorney. He had a friend in the White House and he quickly landed a new job. In the next few Strange things began to happen to some of the candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. During the New Hampshire primary, the state's major newspaper printed a letter accusing Edmund Muskie of making derogatory statements about French Americans. Sometime later it would be discovered that the letter was a phony, but 2 weeks before Election Day it sparked quite a stir. Later, there were fake press releases issued on the stationery of Muskie and Hubert Humphrey. Then, on June 17, 1972, 5 men were discovered breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. The story that eventually unraveled, including spying and political sabotage, had an unprecedented impact on American political life. It eventually forced the resignation of the President of the United States. The Cointelpro documents reveal that none of the Watergate crimes were original. The FBI has for years been doing the same thing, and worse, to the Socialist Workers' Party. Every one of the plumber's dirty tricks had been used for years by the FBI against the SWP, civil rights leaders, and others on the government's enemies list. As this country's political police, the FBI has been assigned the role of determining what ideas are fit for the American people to hear and what ideas are not. Socialism, in their opinion, is not fit. The ruling class, which runs the government, is convinced that it would be better for them if socialism were considered illegitimate or subversive. The idea that the working people of this country should take over its wealth and resources and use them for their own welfare is a subversive idea if you are a capitalist. In the early 1960s, the witch hunt that had dominated American politics during the 1950s was giving way to a greater openness to radical ideas. Socialists began winning a place on the ballot and were more and more being treated as legitimate candidates with a particular point of view. The FBI decided that they had a problem. Cointelpro was their solution. The Cointelpro plot to disrupt socialist election campaigns was concocted not because of any illegal activities by the SWP, but because, as J. Edgar Hoover said, socialist candidates were openly talking to people about their ideas. The documents at the end of this chapter show that the FBI attempted to wreck the 1961 campaign of a black socialist for Manhattan borough president, waged a sustained drive against Clifton DeBerry, the SWP's 1964 presidential candidate, tried to get socialists excluded from supporting an independent black candidate in San Francisco in 1964, and incited an attack on Fred Halstead when he was the SWP presidential candidate in 1968. These actions are only part of the record of FBI sabotage against socialist candidates. And there are operations that remain hidden in files the FBI is refusing to disclose. One Cointelpro operation that has come to light through the socialist suit concerns the 1966 campaign of Judy White for governor of New York. This was during the period when the anti-war movement was beginning to have a major impact on the thinking of the American people. White was a leader of the anti-war movement. A broad layer of opponents of the war, including many radicals who were not particularly close to the SWP, had endorsed White as the only anti-war candidate in the race. Campaign supporters worked hard to get the signatures necessary to obtain ballot status, which brought a significant amount of attention from the media. The FBI looked for a way to sabotage this campaign. They noticed that according to New York law, White was formally not old enough to hold the office of governor. The FBI tried to get this fact reported in the media in an attempt to discredit the campaign. According to the documents, the FBI decided to rely on the Daily News to do the job for them, but the New York City CBS television affiliate did it instead. A copy of the transcript of the editorial broadcast by the station immediately following the election is reproduced in the files. White recently read the Cointelpro papers relating to her campaign. It was the CBS editorial that started the whole controversy that led to the passage of what was called the Anti-Judy White Law, she recalled. As the documents show, the state legislature soon passed a law altering the election code to require that a candidate be old enough to assume an office in order to run for it. Even before the election, CBS was making effective use of the charge that I wasn't old enough. "I'm sure the FBI must have planted this idea," White said. "We were getting many hours of broadcast time, which was uncommon then. But a few days before the elections it abruptly stopped. I was scheduled to go on CBS with the other candidates for governor on a special one-hour program. Suddenly, CBS informed us that my appearance was cancelled. They said I was not a legally qualified candidate because of my age. Of course, White was legally qualified to run for office, that was why the law was changed. Today people under 30 are legally ineligible to run for governor of New York. These documents indicate that the FBI may have been responsible for getting this legislation on the books. The next set of documents concerns an FBI undercover plot implemented the previous year. The city was Denver, where the Socialist Workers' Party was fielding candidates in the elections for school board. In an effort to prevent these people from being elected, the Denver office proposed to FBI headquarters that a letter be sent to the president of the Denver School Board to alert him to the fact that socialists were running for positions on the board. The Denver FBI included in its proposal to Washington an article about the SWP that had appeared in the Denver Post the previous year. That article branded the SWP as both subversive and on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. The FBI likes the media to refer to the SWP in this fashion, and there is every reason to believe that the FBI was involved in writing that story. The Attorney General's list, a McCarthy-era compilation of subversive organizations, was officially abolished by Nixon during his last days in office. However, the government still maintains a secret list of subversive organizations for use by government agencies. The FBI seemed to be irritated because the Denver press had failed to label the SWP as subversive when the party announced its school board candidates. Washington gave the go-ahead for a letter from a concerned mother. The next group of documents exposes an FBI operation aimed at a black socialist. The FBI tried to ruin Paul Boutel's campaign for mayor of New York in 1969 and to drive him and other blacks out of the SWP. The FBI discovered through its surveillance of the SWP that Boutel had been arrested in New Jersey and falsely charged with possession of stolen property while he was helping a friend to move. The FBI sought to exploit this by circulating information on the arrest to the press. While no New York newspaper ever printed the story, the FBI indicates in a document printed here that the information might have been passed on to supporters of Mayor John Lindsay, who was running for re-election, thus encouraging them to challenge the petitions the SWP had submitted in order to obtain ballot status. This challenge resulted in the Board of Elections ruling the SWP off the ballot, and the party was forced to run a write-in campaign. If this was caused by the FBI, as they suggest, that makes this one of the more successful Cointelpro operations. The second part of the plot was less successful. The FBI followed up by mailing Boutel a racist letter, purportedly from a white member of the SWP, attacking him for both the arrest and remarks Boutel had made at an earlier SWP convention. The effect of this letter, as recorded in FBI files and as recalled by members of the SWP who were in New York in 1969, is instructive. The FBI has made other political organizations the target of this type of disruption with some success, but these tactics do not prove very useful against a politically seasoned and experienced organization like the SWP. Boutel brought the letter directly to the attention of a meeting of the New York SWP, where it could be openly discussed. Party members immediately spotted the letter as the work of police. "We've been through this before," the FBI quotes one member as saying. "No one in the SWP wrote that." There are those who are horrified by the Watergate crimes, yet feel that the use of the same tactics against socialists is excusable in the name of national security. They accept the notion that certain ideas and the advocates of those ideas are beyond the pale. One of the main lessons of both Watergate and the Cointelpro papers is that the use of such illegal methods against political opponents cannot remain limited to socialists. If tolerated, they will inevitably be aimed at other forces in this society who run into conflict with the powers that be. This is an important conclusion to be drawn by the labor movement and others. Early in 1946 a young sailor named Fred Halstead was stationed on a ship off the coast of China. World War II had just ended, but on the mainland of China the fighting had not stopped. A civil war was raging. Back in Washington the rulers of this country were very interested in the outcome of that struggle. They would have liked to send their army in to back Chiang Kai-shek's crumbling forces, but their attempts to stall the demobilization of American troops after the war provoked M888I protests among the GIA. It was clear that large-scale U.S. military intervention in China was out of the question. 2 decades later when the United States began committing thousands of troops to another Asian country in an attempt to hold back a revolution, Fred Halstead remembered what he had seen while he was in the Navy. He was convinced that there were important lessons for the growing movement against the war in Vietnam. In an interview, Halstead talked about this and about some revelations contained in the Cointelpro papers. Halstead was the Socialist Workers' Party candidate for president in 1968. During the campaign he made a trip to Vietnam. It now turns out the FBI had tried to sabotage that trip. Among the documents turned over to the SWP under federal court order is evidence that the FBI wrote a news story that it sought to have placed in the military press. The FBI's purpose was to provoke violence against the socialist presidential candidate during his visit to Vietnam. It should be an interesting experience for Mr. Hai.ead when he encounters the men who have served both their own country and others in the interest of freedom, the FBI's article concluded. Before describing that experience, Halstead described what he had seen at the close of the Second World War. I was attached to a ship that was part of the 7th Fleet in Chinese waters. Ostensibly, we were there to repatriate Japanese troops, Halstead said. But after unloading our passengers in Japan, we found ourselves loading up again. This time with Chinese troops, which we took to a port in northern China. This was part of the UBA of the American Navy to ABBIST Jiang's offensive in the Chinese Civil War. Well, most of us didn't know there was such a thing as a civil war in China until we found ourselves more or 1,888 involved in it. The GIA had just finished one war, and they didn't like the idea of getting into another one. Soon a protest movement developed. I remember walking into the Red Crow 88 building in Shanghai where GIA would go to get coffee and hamburgers, Als said. There I saw this big banner with the words, GIA Unite? We want to go home. There were mimeograph machines aboard the GPS and on the army poets, and leaflets expressing that demand were reproduced. I didn't organize all this, but I picked leaflets and read them out, Halstead recalled. He also remembers attending meetings where some of the organizers gave speeches condemning imperialism. But mainly, it was a movement of GIA who just wanted to go home. They held some big demonstrations. There was one in Manila and another in Shanghai. The message got through, and orders boon came in to return to the United States. This made an impression on me that I didn't forget. That you could organize among GIA, Halstead remarked. Just that simple proposition. When he got back home, Halstead had some additional experiences that he later found useful in the anti-war movement. He went to work as a civilian seaman in the Merchant Marine, where he was a member of the Sailors Union of the Pacific. Before long he was screened off that job by the Coast Guard for being a subversive. A fellow named John Mahoney up in Seattle had been fired for criticizing the bureaucracy of the Union, Halstead recalled. A lot of people who had come to his defense were fired. I had passed out some leaflets on the case. That's probably the reason my name got turned over to the Coast Guard. After going to school on the GI Bill for a while, Halstead got a job as an automobile worker and became active in a United/Auto Workers, UAW, organizing drive. The Korean War came along and we lost that drive, in part because of the hysteria around the war and the red baiting that developed. Halstead next learned garment cutting, which has been his trade ever since. As a member of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGWU, he participated in the union's organizing campaigns. At times, Halstead was assigned by the union to get a job in an unorganized shop. The ILGWU paid him the difference between the salary he received there and union scale wages, while he spearheaded the drive for union recognition. Halstead also participated in efforts during that period to organize agricultural workers in California. In 1953 Halstead moved to Detroit, where he landed a job in an automobile plant cutting cloth for the upholstery in cars. I had been working there for about a year when the Square D strike broke out, Halstead said. That strike occurred during the depths of the witch hunt and was of some importance. Square D was an electrical manufacturing firm under contract to the United Electrical Workers, which was one of the unions expelled from the CIO for communist domination. The company was out to break the strike and was nearly successful. What finally saved the union was the massive response of UAW militants, including Fred Halstead, who rallied to the defense of the Square D strikers and beat back the company and the scab-herding cops. In the course of the strike, Halstead became the victim of a frame-up attempt by the Detroit police and their loyalty squad. But the cops' Red Scare hoax failed, and the charges were eventually dropped. When the movement against United States involvement in Vietnam began to develop, Halstead became one of its leaders. He joined the staff of the New York Fifth Avenue Vietnam Peace Parade Committee upon its inception in 1965, and he remained there until he left to run for president in 1967. After his campaign, he again worked in the anti-war movement, and he was involved in organizing every major national demonstration. Today, after years of anti-war demonstrations by veterans and frequent manifestations of anti-war sentiment within the military, it may seem hard to believe that at first many opponents of the war wrote off GLS as war criminals and rejected the possibility of winning them as allies. But that was all too frequently the case. When the anti-war movement came along, there were discussions about where we should spread the word, Halstead recalled. One obvious place, I would suggest, was right inside the army. You're crazy, people would say to me. They are butchers, and there is nothing we can do about that. I would tell them that they were wrong, that GLS are just ordinary people who will be irresponsive to the same arguments as civilians, Halstead continued. I knew GLS could be reached because I had been a GI myself and I had seen GLS organize. The trip to Vietnam. Why did Halstead decide to visit Vietnam in the summer of 1968? During the presidential campaign that year, Lyndon Johnson tried to convey the impression that the war was almost over. Nixon and Humphrey, the candidates of the two capitalist parties, made a pact between themselves not to make the war an issue in the campaign. The SWP's candidate went to Vietnam as part of the socialist strategy to try to inject the war into the presidential campaign as the major issue. We demanded the immediate withdrawal of the American forces as the only way to end the killing over there and as the only legal and moral thing for the United States to do, Halstead recalled. That year there was a tendency on the part of some in the anti-war movement to get into electoral activity as a substitute for anti-war demonstrations. Through this campaign we encouraged the anti-war movement to stay in the streets. There was another reason for making the trip. We wanted to illustrate to the anti-war movement that it could reach GLS, Halstead said, and we wanted to demonstrate to the GLS that the anti-war movement was on their side. On August 15, 1968, Fred Halstead arrived in Saigon. He was accompanied by Barry Shepard, who was at that time editor of The Militant. They spent 5 days in Vietnam, including a visit to the big army base at Long Binh, talking with Gia. The Militant carried reports from Vietnam and what they found. We were interested in talking to the American Gia who were on the scene, Halstead said. They had a right to vote and to listen to what the candidates had to say. They also had a right to have an opinion on the war, a greater right than any American citizen, including the President. I went there to ask them what that opinion was. What did he find? The overwhelming majority of them were not willing to suddenly join the peace movement, but they weren't supporters of the war either, Halstead remembered. They were mainly confused, looking for answers, still making up their minds. That was all the more reason for the anti-war movement to have the stance and attitude that they were interested in reaching Giyawaro and their aid, Halstead observed. I also asked Barry Shepherd about his Impriayana. We found no hostility to us among any troops, he recalled, including those who were for the war at that point. There were anti-war figures who thought I would get into trouble talking to Gia in Vietnam, Halstead remembered. And I might have gotten into difficulty speaking to the Gia the way they did. If I had called butchers and told them they were immoral for not refusing the draft, I probably would have gotten a fiat in my face. Instead, Halstead explained that he was a candidate from the United States who was active in the anti-war movement. He said that he thought this country never belonged in Vietnam and should get out immediately. I was received in a courteous and friendly way, Halstead remembered. Never in a hostile way. Is there any evidence that the FBI was awful in its goal of getting their story about Halstead into the military pre-AI in order to provoke an attack? The item was never picked up and printed as far as Halstead knows. The response we found among the soldiers in Vietnam is the key to understanding why this particular project failed, Shepherd observed. Even those who supported the war offered no strong political motivation. They would argue along the lines that since many lives had already been lost, the war should continue so that those deaths would not have been in vain. An appeal to anti-communism wasn't put forward a compelling reason to stay in Vietnam. However, Shepherd and Halstead both remembered something, which in retrospect they feel might have been a setup under FBI influence. The incident was reported in the militant at the time. Among the best places to meet and talk with Gia, they found, were the bars. One day the two socialists were sitting on stools at a bar, when a white sailor sat down by Shepherd and began talking. While Fred was carrying on a conversation with a group of black GLE on the other side, the white sailor made a remark about black power niggers. It was clearly audible to the black soldiers. A black GI immediately reached over and smashed the sailor in the face. There rapidly ensued a fiat fight, which Halstead and Shepherd managed to avoid. Fortunately, the automatic rifles which some of the Gia in the bar were carrying did not come into play. Halstead and Shepherd suspect that the white sailor could have been acting under instructions to start a fight in hopes that the two socialists would become caught up or even seriously injured in a fight between black and white GLE. On the other hand, they think it could have been, Halstead put it, just a little piece of America. The anti-war movement as a whole would be convinced of the possibility of reaching GLE. What really changed their mind was that they with their own eyes the Gia turning against the war, Halstead told me. You couldn't draft 30,000 youth a month in 1968 and 1969 without getting a lot who had been involved in the anti-war movement in one way or another. Then it just spread all over the army. The interview with Halstead took place in April 1975. The Saigon Army was collapsing and the revolutionary forces were sweeping through Vietnam. By drastically limiting Washington's ability to use its military forces in China, the movement Halstead had seen almost 30 years before when he was a GI in the Pacific had been instrumental in the victory of the Chinese Revolution. Did he see any parallels with Vietnam? I think the fact that the United States finds it so difficult to put its military forces back into Vietnam is a very important factor in the victories that the liberation forces have won. The Pentagon keeps moaning that their hands are tied. Well, what tied their hands is the American anti-war movement. A review is being conducted OFCLIFRO and Barry's file to determine if there is anything derogatory in his background which might cause embarrassment to the SWPIF publicly exposed. Those words appear in a secret FBI memorandum dated October 17, 1963. Of the nearly 1,000 pages of Cointelpro files released in response to the SWP suit, more concern Clifton de Bry than any other single individual. In 1964, DeBerry became the first black person ever to run for President of the United States, when he was nominated by the SWP. Why was the FBI so interested in DeBerry? What was it about this man and his political activities that caused the FBI to devote so much energy to trying to discredit him? To find the answer to these questions, the militant talked with DeBerry about his background, his many years of activity in the Union movement and the Black liberation struggle. DeBerry was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. His family sent him at a young age to live with relatives in Chicago, where they hoped he would find more opportunities open to him. Instinctively a rebel, DeBerry was becoming involved in the gang war scene and about to get into trouble. Fortunately, he ran into a friend who persuaded him to go down south and take part in some union organizing efforts. In late 1942, the two went to Louisiana, where they organized textile workers. Then we went to a little town just outside Nashville, Tennessee, and organized a John Deere farm equipment plant there, DeBerry recalled. After returning to Chicago and participating in several different union organizing drives, DeBerry landed a job at the big international harvester plant. They started me in the shipping department at 77 cents an hour. Our job classification was laborer, DeBerry remembered. I had a talk with the grievance committee representative about changing the wording. We organized the guys and went out on strike for a couple of hours after lunch. They won. Along with the classification change came a pay boost up to $1.35 an hour. After that, the guys there wanted to make me shop steward. But they already had an old-timer, who I later learned was in the Communist Party. But since the workers were determined to make me their shop steward, some people from the CP contacted me. They told me I had to join the CP to become a shop steward. That's how I came to join the Communist Party. After the war, a strike wave swept the country. The FBI's investigation of DeBerry's background discovered that labor trouble charges were placed on his record during this period. How did this happen? We were organized at this time by a very dynamic leader, who later became president of the local. He saw the strikes coming and inspired a lot of us young guys to get prepared. We all went out to an old automobile junkyard. There we practiced until we had developed a technique for dumping cars. That means turning them over. In anticipation of possible attempts by scabs to cross the picket lines in their cars, we constituted roving picket squads of 5 or 6 each. The American working class was in a combative mood. They won some healthy wage increases from the corporations, which were obviously in a position to grant them because of their huggy war profits. DeBerry soon became well known to the Chicago Police Labor Squad. They developed the habit of picking up DeBerry and his friends as soon as they appeared on the scene of a strike. The cops would take them to the station but would soon release them without pressing charges, thus effectively preventing them from performing their scab removal operation. That is the reason so little shows up on my record, DeBerry commented. As always during a workers' upsurge, the creativity and ingenuity of the rank and file came to the fore, and DeBerry gave an example. There was this group of 3 women who also traveled from picket line to picket line. They had devised a method of disabling scab drivers by throwing an air raid warden's helmet at the windshield of the car. The driver would instinctively throw his hands up to protect his face. At that point we would move in and dump the car. One day a big battle was shaping up at Jones Foundry. My squad showed up early in the morning. Right away we got picked up by the cops and taken downtown. They soon released us, and we headed straight back to Jones. We met up with those 3 women and were getting ready to dump some cars, when the cops nabbed us all. They threw us into the back of one of those big, square back paddy wagons and proceed to take us to the station. Now, these women had been arrested so many times that they had developed this special trick. They would station one person at the front of the wagon to look through a tiny peephole in order to see where the vehicle was headed. As the cops began to steer into a left tum, the one at the peephole would signal to the others who were sitting on benches on either side of the wagon to prepare to stand up and move to the right. If they did this during the tum, it would flip the paddy wagon over. Another person stationed by the door would kick it just as the vehicle hit the ground. This would automatically knock the doors open, so the passengers could escape. So, we followed their instructions. It worked, and we headed straight back to the picket line. Of course, they came looking for us. They picked us up again, took us back downtown, and booked us this time, WRRY said. That explains how I got those charges on my record. The Cold War. In the late 1940s, the Cold War began to grow more intense. The United States rulers' international offensive against the Soviet Union was accompanied by a domestic offensive against the labor movement, as well as against the American CP. The trade union bureaucracy capitulated to the ruling class on both fronts. At first, the leadership of the Congress of Industrial Organizations had hesitated to endorse the new Cold War foreign policy. But during the presidential elections of 1948 they backed Truman, and along with this endorsement came support of Truman's Cold War policies. This was codified at the 1948 CIO convention. The CP followed a smaller wing of the ruling CL-888, represented by Henry Wallace and his Progressive Party, which preferred a kind of détente with the Soviet Union, a continuation of the wartime cooperation. The cutting edge of the attack on the labor movement was the Taft-Hartley Act, which had been enacted in 1947. The labor movement refused to take up a serious fight against it. Among the provisions of the new law was a prohibition on members of the CP holding office in trade unions. The heads of a few of the unions, including mine, the fan equipment workers, were known Stalinist and, DeBerry said. Philip Murray, the president of the CIO, handed them an ultimatum that they had to get rid of these CP union officials, in accordance with the provisions of Taft-Hartley, or leave the CIO. It was at this time that DeBerry began to run into problems with the CP. Along with the president of his local, WRRY was among those union militants who felt that the Stalinist officials were placing their own personal posts above the interests of a unified labor movement. At the 1949 convention, the CP-led unions were expelled from the CIO. Around this time, the farm equipment workers merged with the United Electrical Workers, another Stalinist-controlled union. After that, the CP took over almost everything in my local, WRRY remembered. I had differences with them on a number of questions, including some of their policies during the Second World War, the no-strike pledge, civil rights, and black caucuses. The economic boom during the war brought unprecedented numbers of blacks into the plants. In some factories, where they were assigned the hardest and most dangerous work, blacks constituted a large percentage of the workers. A black caucus movement began to emerge. I would discuss this caucus idea with some of the stewards in my shop and with black leaders I knew in other locals. We decided it was a good and necessary idea in order to fight the special oppression of blacks, DeBerry recalled. The Black Caucus movement led to the formation of the National Negro Labor Council at a convention in Cincinnati in 1950. I was a delegate from my local. The CP was very instrumental in setting up the whole thing, but they were actually opposed to the formation of black caucuses, although they were reluctant to come out and say it. It was at that convention that Gene Tussey, an SWP member, sold a friend of DeBercy's a copy of The Militant. They liked what they read and asked if there was a chapter of the SWP in Chicago. She said there was and gave UE the names of some people to look up. DeBerry was approaching an important turning point in high life. He would soon join the SWP. In 1964 he would be the party's candidate for President of the United States and would become a prime target of the FBI. As DeBerry moved closer to the SWP and began to raise political questions with the Stalinist leadership of the Communist Party, the pressure on him mounted. The CP began to bring in specialists who tried to persuade WRCY politically of the error of his ways. When that failed, the CP tried other methods. I ran into a couple of dudes from the neighborhood hanging around the gates in front of the plant, DeBercy recalled. I happened to ask them what they were up to, and they told me they were there to educate somebody. After a little probing I discovered they were being paid to educate me. I convinced them that they should collect the money from the people. WHO had put them up to this, but there was no need to do the job. Not long after this, things came to a head. There was an impending strike, which the CP was desperately trying to avert. The stewards' body voted to go out, and since the CP-controlled leadership had made no provisions for a strike, the stewards were forced to assume organizational responsibility. But the combination of a demoralizing scandal over the CP's misuse of union funds, a House Un-American Activities Committee visit to Chicago to red-bait the union, and a well-organized strike-breaking effort led to the defeat of the strike. After WE went back I was fired, WRCY said. I've always thought the CP and the company got together to get rid of me, partly because other CP members on the executive board were retained. The country was in the grip of the McCarthyite witch hunt, and years before the incidents documented in the Cointelpro papers, WRCY became familiar with the way the FBI operates. I would get a job, and it would only last 3 days. I would go from one job to another, and it would be the same story. The FBI would visit my boss, and I would be fired. DeBerry finally managed to hang on to a job when a stubborn employer refused to fire him. Nonetheless, he was told that FBI agents continued to come around every 4 days to check up on him. DeBerry eventually got into painting, and remains a painter by trade. The Civil Rights Movement. In 1954 the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its historic decision on school desegregation. Soon the country would witness a new black civil rights movement and the opening stages of a new radicalization. At this time the center of DeBerry's political activity shifted from the trade union movement to another arena of the class struggle. DeBerry was active in the Chicago chapter of the NAACP and in the Washington Park Forum, a black community organization. In 1955, news of the lynching of Emmett Till, a black youth from Chicago, jolted the black community. Till was murdered by racists while visiting relatives in Miaoapi. WRRYW as instrumental in organizing a mass meeting to protest THELYNCHing. The 1955-56 Montgomery, Alabama, bus boycott to end segregation on the buses signaled the beginning of the civil rights movement. In Chicago, WRRY organized a station wagons to Montgomery committee, which raised funds to purchase vehicles for use by boycott era. DeBerry personally delivered one of the station wagons to Montgomery, where he stayed at the home of E.D. Nixon. Like DeBerry, Nixon was a veteran of the union movement who brought his organizational and political know-how to the new black civil rights struggle. Nixon was actually the central organizer of the boycott. I talked with Nixon about the boycott movement, how it originated, how it functioned, and what they expect to gain, DeBerry recalled. For the first time I met Dr. Martin Luther King, who had been persuaded to enter the fight by Nixon. In 1960 DeBerry moved to New York. That same year a sit-in movement to desegregate public accommodations began in the South. Supporters of the desegregation fight organized a boycott of the Woolworth chain in cities outside the South in a successful attempt to bring added or to end segregation. WRRY threw himself into building the Woolworth boycott in Brooklyn. In the early 19,608 a black nationalist mood was becoming visible in the ghettos of the North, and no one better articulated this new consciousness than Malcolm X. We began to make contact with Malcolm when he was still the main spokesman for the Nation of Islam. DeBerry said. In late 1963 I went on a speaking tour. Malcolm was touring at the same time, and I would go to see him whenever I could. It was during a tour stop in Chicago that the FBI ordered to have DeBerry arrested in order to create a scandal they hoped to use to discredit him. Just as DeBerry was about to address a society meeting, the Chicago police stormed into the building, hauled him to the station, and booked him on charges of non-support of his ex-wife. There are many censored passages throughout the Cointelpro papers, but there are entire pa/jes concern this operation that were totally blank when THEY were turned over to the SWP by THE FBI. These blank pages obviously detailed the maneuver the FBI engaged in to engineer DeBerry's arrest. The FBI followed up this arrest by devoting enormous attention to trying to get the news media to report both this incident and DeBerry's earlier R4 labor trouble. The 1964 campaign. On January 7, 1964, the National Committee of the Soci-Workin' Party announced the nomination of DeBerry as the SWP's candidate for president. Lyndon Johnson was rung for re-election, and he was opposed by Barry Goldwater. Johnson camped as a PEA's candidate who was opposed to escalating the war, while Goldwater favored increased bombing. Most Americans took Johnson's peace rhetoric for good coin, and he won a landslide victory. Virtually the entire left supported Johnson's candidacy. Among the most enthusiastic back in the Democratic candidate were the members of the CP, whose attitude was made up in the title of a pamphlet by Gus Hall, The 11th Hour: Defeat the New Fascist Threat. The SWP, in contrast, clearly nailed Johnson as the imperialist warrior he was. The historical record now shows how right the SWP was. In August 1964, a supposed Vietnamese attack on USG 80FF the coast of North Vietnam provided the excuse for rushing a special resolution through Congress. It was under the authority of this Gulf of Tonkin resolution that Johnson and the subsequent presidents committed the United States to a massive military intervention in Vietnam. DeBerry charged that the whole thing had been set up by the White House and the Pentagon. The incidents between the U.S. destroyer and the PT boats were the pretext, not the cause, of the U.S. air attack, DeBerry said at the time. Several years later the Pentagon Papers would prove that he was totally correct. We of the Socialist Workers' Party say get all the U.S. True-8 planes and warships out of Vietnam North and South, DeBerry demanded. If as Johnson lame 11 their purpose is to protect democracy, then send them to Mississippi and let them do some protect black Americans there. While the FBI was secretly plotting against the black presidential candidate, he was publicly blasting the FBI. After the disappearance of 3 civil rights workers slain by racists in Mississippi, DeBerry exposed the Bureau's complicity. Local cops, who were involved in the murders, had held the 3 in jail before they were killed. While the 3 kidnapped youths were in jail in Philadelphia, Mississippi, their co-workers became feared for their safety, and telephoned the FBI in Jackson. The FBI agent refused to help and told the rights fighters that he wouldn't have any more dealings with them, DeBerry said. In July 1964 a group of major civil rights leaders, including Roy Wilkins and Martin Luther King, issued a call for a moratorium on civil rights demonstrations until after Election Day. The purpose was to make it easier for Johnson to hold on to the racist vote, which was threatening to go to Goldwater. DeBerry condemned the move. This is the surest way for Negroes to get nothing. Black people must develop independent political force. That's the only way they can be a power and the only way they can defend themselves against the attacks of the racists which will come whether Johnson or Goldwater is elected. When Malcolm X, who was in Egypt at the time, heard about the moratorium, he had a similar reaction. The black leaders have sold themselves out and become campaign managers in the Negro community for Lyndon Johnson, he charged. During this period DeBerry's relationship with Malcolm continued to develop. After his break with the Nation of Islam, I used to meet with him almost every Saturday when he was in the country. We would have discussions about politics, often comparing notes and checking up on what each other had been hearing about the developing nationalist response among blacks, DeBerry recalled. At the suggestion of Malcolm and his collaborator, James Shabazz, DeBrry spoke at a couple of classes at the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which Malcolm headed. We were again touring at the same time, and our paths would often crisscross. Whenever I could I would attend his speeches. While he was too busy to make it to mine, he would send someone over, DeBerry remembered. We had that kind of relationship. A few months later Malcolm would be assassinated. The FBI's role in that event is a story that is yet to be told. Did the BRRY have any suspicion about the FBI's behind-the-scenes moves during his campaign? One thing comes to mind. At the Chicago police station, when I was arrested on the non-support charge, I ran into a cop I knew. He had been on the labor squad during some of my earlier run-ins with the Chicago police. At one point while they were booking me, there was no one else around except the two of us. In a confidential tone he told me, "Somebody who is high up is really interested in you." If you had picked up a copy of The Militant in late July 1961, you would have noticed that 2 of the 6 pages in the paper were devoted to the Socialist Workers' Party candidates in the upcoming New York City elections. The official trade union movement was deep in the morass of Democratic Party politics, where it remains today, and the SWP was offering the voters of New York an alternative. 4 working-class candidates were running for the top positions. The candidate for Manhattan Borough President was a black man named Clarence Franklin. "I live in a 1.5-room apartment in a crowded tenement in Manhattan and I have to pay 40% of my total monthly wage for rent," Franklin wrote in The Militant. He offered a socialist solution to New York's housing problem. At the New York FBI office there were people who pored over that issue of The Militant with unusual care. J. Edgar Hoover had recently sent out special instructions for FBI agents to be alert for possible Cointelpro operations, and someone in the New York office spotted the opportunity for a vicious attack against both the black movement and the SWP. The vast FBI arrest files told them that Clarence Franklin had some years earlier acquired a criminal record. That fact is not very unusual. Many black workers in this society find themselves in trouble with the law. But the agents in charge of Cointelpro thought they could use his record to embarrass him and the SWP and to drive a black activist out of politics. /10f The things that come through clearest in the Cointelpro papers is that the FBI reserved a special hatred for the black civil rights movement, and black members of the SWP were singled out for special attention. Cointelpro files document a pattern of systematic sabotage dire at the black movement that makes the Watergate break-in and Donald Segretti's dirty tricks against the Democrats look like college pranks. Segretti and other Watergaters have been sent to jail, but the conspirators responsible for Cointelpro have yet to be charged with breaking any law. Clarence Franklin was born into a family of Mississippi sharecroppers in 1932. When he was 10 years old he moved to New York, where his mother went to work as a house cleaner. When he was 14 he got a job setting pins in a bowling alley. Through the years Franklin found work as a dishwasher, porter, and construction laborer. Along the way he picked up an arrest record. One might assume that a law enforcement agency such as the FBI would have noted with satisfaction that Franklin had not been charged with violating any law in several years and was currently engaged in perfectly legal activity running for public office. H6 Weaver, the FBI had different concerns. Careful consideration has been given to the fact that the SWP in New York City is now getting some propaganda attention through the press, television, and radio because it has succeeded in placing on the ballot 4 candidates for office in the New York City fall elections, the FBI wrote. In a subsequent memorandum not printed here, the FBI elaborated. The SWP has met with little or no opposition in carrying forth its aims and purpose and in securing positions on the ballot for its candidates. It is felt that some disruptive action should be taken. The FBI evidently used one of its numerous agents in the NER's media, this one at the Daily News, to break the story. The News published a story on Franklin's arrest record on election day. It is worth noting that the rules of fair play between Democratic and Republican politicians brand as unfair campaign practices 11th-hour charges that are impossible to answer before the voters go to the polling place. This, of course, did not stop the FBI. The FBI's evaluation of this operation shows that they were elated because Franklin became demorally the publicity about his past. When Franklin eventually withdrew from political activity, the FBI congratulated itself on a job well done. The next set of documents concerns a 1964 FBI plot. The aim was to sabotage the defense of a group of civil rights workers facing prison in Monroe, North Carolina. These FBI papers accord SWP leader George Weissmann the dubious distinction of being the first publicly known subject of an FBI poem. The poet tried to frame Weissmann on charges of stealing money from the Monroe home of Dr. A.E. Perry, head of the Committee to Aid the Monroe Defendants, CAMD, and Vice President of the Monroe NAACP. The poem, along with a clipping from a North Carolina newspaper showing that Weissmann had been in Perry's house at the time of a robbery, was sent to a carefully selected FBI mailing list. In 1964 George Weissmann was managing editor of The Militant. He had first visited Monroe in 1958 to report on the notorious kissing case. Robert F. Williams, president of the Monroe NAACP, had received attention in the press by organizing armed defense guards, which put a stop to a series of Ku Klux Klan assaults on the black community. The Klan focused particular attention on Dr. Perry, who had been instrumental in the struggle to integrate some of Monroe's public facilities. In retaliation against the black community, the local racist authorities charged two black youths, 8 and 10 years old, with assault upon a white female for the crime of being kissed by a white playmate. The two were tried and committed to a reformatory possibly until they are 21. Weissmann recalled these events in a recent interview. I was sent down for The Militant and wrote several stories about that case, Weissmann said. Socialists aided in the formation of the Committee to Combat Racial Injustice, and Williams became its chairman. The committee mounted a campaign to publicize the case of these little boys and to bring pressure on the North Carolina authorities to get them released, Weissmann recalled. In a matter of months, the resulting national and international protest led to their freedom. In this period I became personal friends with both Williams and Perry, Weissmann said, and they often visited me when they were in New York. When a new attack on the black community in Monroe made the news in August 1961, members of the SWP were among the first to come to the victims' defense. Thea was the time of the Freedom Rides. Buses filled with dedicated opponents of segregation traveled through the Deep South, where they challenged laws requiring separation of the races in public accommodations. Monroe had acquired a reputation as a Klan stronghold, and Will.i.am invited some of the Freedom Riders to visit the city. A number of Freedom Riders and their return from Miaoapi stopped off in Monroe to meet Will.i.am and do what they could, Way 88 men remembered. They decided to institute a week-long picket at the courthouse, the scene of many miscarriages of justice. Thea enraged local racists, and after several days of picketing, things came to a head. On August a mob attacked the picketers, and police responded by arresting the Freedom Riders. When word of Thea reached the black community, the people became enraged and began preparing to defend themselves against a racist attack, Weissmann said. About this time a middle-aged white couple from another city wandered into the black community. Residents stopped the car and took its occupants to Will.i.am home. Will.i.am offered to allow them to stay there until things cooled down. The couple later left unharmed. But local authorities brought phony charges of kidnapping against Will.i.am, Harold Reed and Richard Crowder, young black Monroe residents, May Mallory, a black woman from New York who had been working with Will.i.am, and Robert Low-Rye, a white Freedom Rider from New York. Will.i.am and Mallory escaped from North Carolina, while Crowder, Reed, and Lowry were jailed in Monroe. Supporters quickly AET up the CAMD to fight the anticipated extradition orders for Mallory, who was in Ohio, and Will.i.am, whose whereabouts remained unknown, and to raise bail money for the three defendants in Monroe. Will.i.am soon arrived in Cuba, where he obtained asylum. The state of Ohio eventually extradited Mallory to North Carolina. When the case came to trial in 1964, I went down there to cover it both for the Militant, which gave more attention to events in Monroe than any newspaper in the country, and the Nation magazine, Weissman said. I had written an article for the Nation at the time of the kissing case, and the editor commissioned me to do another story this time. That's how I happened to be in Monroe at the time of the robbery at Dr. Perry's home. Perry's house served as a gathering place for supporters of the defendants during the trial. On this particular day, since I had to meet a militant deadline, I remained in the house while the others went to court, W. Eisman recalled. While I was alone in the house, there was a phone call for Dr. Perry. When I said he was not there, the caller asked me who was there besides myself. I said there was no one. An hour or so later the doorbell rang, and I looked out through the GLA 88 and I saw a young black man with an envelope. I opened the door, and he said that the envelope was for Dr. Perry. When I reached to take it, he produced a pistol. The robber directed Weissman to the basement. A second man, whom Weissman did not see, entered the house. They tied Weissman to a chair and went upstairs. After they left, I freed myself, Way88 man said. About the same time Dr. Perry and the others returned from the trial. It turned out that a wall safe hidden in the closet had been broken into and robbed. Since it was not unusual for doctors to keep money in their offices, this was assumed at the time to be a simple robbery. Weissman now has second thoughts about that. Looking back on it now, especially in view of the revelations about the methods of the FBI and the CIA, I wonder if they had a hand in it. There is no dire evidence of that in the Cointelpro documents currently available, but Weissman thinks it warrants looking into. The investigation of the robbery seemed mostly aimed at me, Weissman remembers. The state police proposed that I take a lie detector test. The documents on pages 95 to 99 outline this operation. In another document not reproduced here, the FBI openly stated that its goal was to cause the SWP and CAMD to cease their efforts on behalf of the defendants. The Monroe defendant's conviction was overturned, and the prosecution was not able to try the case again. However, Williams is now back in the United States and is still fighting extradition to North Carolina. After several months of disciplinary silence imposed on him for making statements that black Muslim leader Elijah Muhammad frowned on, Malcolm X broke discipline with remarks the whole world heard. 1964 threatens to be a very explosive year, he told a jam-packed news conference March 12, 1964, in publicly announcing his break from the Nation of Islam. He said he was prepared to cooperate in local civil rights actions in the South and elsewhere, pointing out that every campaign for specific objectives can only heighten the political consciousness of black people. We should be peaceful, law-abiding, he said, but the time has come for the American Negro to fight back in self-defense whenever and wherever he is being unjustly and unlawfully attacked. Then he hurled a challenge to the government. If the government thinks I am wrong for saying this, then let the government start doing its job. The United States rulers, of course, did think Malcolm was wrong, and they told their FBI to start doing their job, a job they may have tried to finish on February 21, 1965, when 3 men gunned down Malcolm. But their work did not stop with Malcolm's death. This is revealed in a batch of Cointelpro memos released in response to the Socialist Workers' Party suit to stop government surveillance and harassment. Cointelpro was aimed at destroying socialist and black organizations. In a 1967 letter, J. Edgar Hoover gave his reasons for initiating a special Cointelpro operation against black organizations. The purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalist, bait-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters. Cointelpro memos present the fuzzy outlines of the FBL's earlier attempt to blackjack relations between the SWP and the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, MMI, and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, after Malcolm's death. Malcolm created both organizations after high break with the Nation of Islam. The mosque was for Muslim activists, but the OAAU did not require religious adherence for membership. In a May 25, 1965, letter to the New York office, Hoover wrote, "It would appear that the apparent attempt by the SWP to exploit the followers of the late Malcolm X for its own benefit offers some potential for the institution of disruptive tactics." On June 15, 1965, New York responded, SWP influence on THE followers of Malcolm X would be disrupted by emphasizing the atheism of the SWP as opposed to the basic religious orientation of the MMI. Washington approved. In August 1965, the New York office wrote to Hoover boasting that the operation had soured relations between the socialists and Malcolm's followers. It is believed probable that the disintegrating relations between the SWP and the OAAU can be attributed to the disruptive tactic authorized, and will result in a continued loss of influence by the SWP among this group of Negro. In a recent interview with the militant, Harlem activist Charles Kenyatta, who was prominent among Malcolm's followers, called the Cointelpro tactics criminal, but said he was not surprised at the NEW revelations. When you have one man who was as great as Malcolm was, then you can expect these FBI and CIA tactics against him and his followers. He said if there is anything to learn, it is not to let these petty tactics and differences divide us. Although a new Cointelpro conspiracy against black groups was launched in 1967, the documents reproduced herein. Others reveal that FBI harassment of the black movement predates 1967. Reflecting the U.S. rulers' fear and hatred of the black struggle, especially militant or uncompromising organizations, the FBI and local police had singled out the Muslims for harassment and physical attacks in the early 1960s, and the militant obtained a secret Los Angeles Police Department report on the Muslims and printed it in 1962. The men of this group are extremely dangerous, the report said. Further, they are a type of fanatic, and are willing to die for their cause, content if they can take a Caucasian, preferably a police officer, and this includes Negro police officers too, with them when they are killed. The militant ran an editorial responding to the cops' racist views. For socialists and other champions of civil rights, the question of agreement or disagreement with the black Muslims' demands for racial separation should in no way becloud the main issue: defense of the rights of the black Muslims against police and political persecution. Today, virtually every voice on the left and even many ruling class voices are forced to pay tribute to Malcolm. But before his death they wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. With the exception of the SWP, radical organizations had fallen victim to the false propaganda that said Malcolm thrived on white hatred and was a general, around troublemaker and divisionmonger among black people. This was most clearly expressed by the Communist Party. In an article in the CP's August 1963 Political Affairs, Stalinist leader Benjamin Davis said that the civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham dynamited the irrational and irresponsible drivel of Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, whose anti-white racism, anti-Semitism, and backwardness proved utterly banked. RUP. The pursuit of either the Muslim black versus white policy or the Williams advocacy of armed insurrection cannot but be divisive of Negro unity, Davis wrote. He was proposing, against Malcolm's and Robert F. Williams' and call for black self-defense in the face of armed racist attacks in the South, reliance on the promise of civil rights bills and handouts from white liberals. Opposition to the hopelessness and abject defeatism of a Malcolm X is not a matter of competing for transient applause, it is a question of principle, according to Davis. In contrast to the CP, THESWP saw it as a responsibility to support the political actions that Malcolm and the Muslims took against their oppression. When Malcolm announced his break with the Nation of Islam, The SWP looked forward to working with him in whatever fraternal manner it could. Clifton D. Berry, the SWP's 1964 presidential nominee, commented in a news statement on what Malcolm had to say. "I heartily agree with Malcolm X that every militant civil rights struggle helps the Negro understand the need for black political power," D. Berry said. "I will do all I can in this campaign to rally support for these views. I am confident Malcolm X's stand will add new power to the drive for freedom now." Malcolm soon accepted an invitation to speak at a militant forum. Malcolm spoke kindly of the militant. At his first militant forum he spoke at 3. He said, "I think, as I said earlier, the paper is one of the best I've read. We always encourage those in Harlem to buy it when we see it up there, or wherever else we may see it. It's a very good paper, and I hope they continue to have success, make progress." Even when he was still in the Nation of Islam, Malcolm urged blacks to buy the militant because of its forthright opposition to police attacks on the Muslims. Militant staff writer Harry Ring interviewed Malcolm for WBAI-FM in January 1966, and in that same month The Young Socialist, the publication of the Young Socialist Alliance, interviewed him. Before the interview was published, Malcolm was shown the edited transcript. He remarked, "This is the kind of editing it's a pleasure to read." Malcolm did not endorse D. Berry's candidacy, but he said he would open some doors in Harlem for his campaign. Before he left on his second trip to Africa in July 1964, Malcolm instructed his top leaders to cooperate with the socialist campaign in this fashion. In January 1965, the YSA broached with Malcolm the idea of going on a YSA-sponsored tour of college campuses. Malcolm liked the idea but said he could not go until he returned from another scheduled trip abroad. Malcolm opposed the Vietnam War and expressed interest in the SWP's participation in the coming April 17, 1965, anti-war march in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the Students for a Democratic Society. All during BIA late year, Malcolm's views became more and more militant and anti-capitalist. The Harlem Ghetto had exploded in revolt against grinding oppression in 1964, and militant nationalist beliefs which Malcolm was beat at popularizing black awareness were catching on fute. Malcolm's call for black power was getting through to thousands of black who were eager to listen. His message got through to a few people including the FBI who jerked in fear whenever they heard it. It was a bright, spring-like Sunday when the sandy-headed Mulum minister unfolded BIA lanky frame behind a lectern at the Audubon Ballroom to spread BIA message for the last time. From nowhere 3 men who to this day have never publicly said who put them up to it made their way to within what the coroner said was point-blank range. One pulled the triggers of the sawed-off, double-barreled shotgun he carried. The gun, it was said, made an awesome sound. For over a decade, the most explosive I-88 UE in world politics was the American intervention in Vietnam. It was the growing M888 opposition to the war among the American people that gave the radicalization of the 60s and 70s its biggest push. With the American withdrawal and the fall of the Saigon dictatorship in the spring of 1975, people in all parts of the political spectrum began aiding the Vietnam War era. The revelation of the FBL's schemes against the anti-war movement provides an interesting sidelight to that review. Alio helps confirm the analysis the socialists made at the beginning of the movement that it could pose a serious threat to the power of the Pentagon and Wall Street and eventually force the government to pull out of Vietnam. The Cointelpro papers reveal several instances of behind-the-scenes FBI maneuvers to block the development of a maze, visible protest movement against the war. A variety of techniques were employed to achieve this task. These included promoting splits among anti-war forces, encouraging red baiting of socialists, and pushing violent confrontations as an alternative to M888 peaceful demonstrations. One of the more unusual operations uncovered to date is a 1966 FBI attempt to divert the Socialist Workers' Party from its strong commitment to the anti-war struggle. The FBI mailed out an anonymous open letter to Trotskyites. That and related documents are reproduced here. The letter was designed to create dissatisfaction within the party over its participation in the new movement. In particular, the FBI sought to create dissension within the SWP and Young Socialist Alliance over their role at a November 1965 anti-war conference in Washington, D.C. The Ma 88 movement against the war in Vietnam, and socialist participation in it, had begun with a call by THE students for a democratic society for an April 1965 march on Washington. SOS in 1965 possessed a measure of respectability. Officially, it was still the youth group of the League for Industrial Democracy, a longtime meeting ground for conservative social democrats and union bureaucrats. Consequently, the SDS National Council's decision to call the march, made its meeting over the December 1964 school break, carried some authority. Doug Jennis joined the staff of the YSA National Office that January. We met with Clark Kissinger, the SDS National Secretary, to discuss what we could do, he recalls. The YSA organized 3 national tours, one on the West Coast, one in the Midwest, and I toured the eastern states. YSA locals across the country quickly began to help organize student participation in the march. During that winter, Ly and Don Johnson escalated the war, and the impact helped to tum out 20,000 people, more than anyone had expected. The day after the march I attended an SOS National Council meeting there in Washington, Jennis said. Surprisingly, they failed to follow up on their original initiative. SOS pulled away from the anti-war movement and never again focused its energies on a national level toward the war. Nevertheless, the anti-war movement continued to grow. The Teach-In movement, born on March 24 at the University of Michigan, spread spontaneously from campus to campus. In late May, the Berkeley, California, Vietnam Day Committee, in which the SWP and YSA played a role, brought out 30,000 people for a 34-hour marathon teach-in and protest against the war. Meeting in Washington, D.C., August 6 to 9, a national anti-war gathering, the A88 Assembly of Unrepresented People, as it was called, drew some 2,000 participants. There a much smaller meeting of anti-war activists from around the country decided to set up a national coordinating committee to end the war in Vietnam. The NCC scheduled a convention during the Thanksgiving weekend in Washington, D.C. This is the conference referred to in the FBI's open letter. The socialist ment of the anti-war movement is contained in Revolutionary Strategy in the Fight Ago.inst The Vietnam War, a collection of articles and documents recently published by the SWP National Education Department. It contains a transcript of a June 25, 1965, SWP Political Committee discussion that envisioned the main lines along which the movement would develop. Jack Barnes, who is today the SWP National Secretary, described the main divisions that would emerge within the movement. They'll be over the question of exclusion versus non-exclusion and the question of unconditional opposition to the war. They'll take place over the question of subordinating the demands of the anti-war movement to the demands of progressive politicians. Drawing their initial inspiration from preparations for the April 17 march and then spurred on by the continuing escalation of both the war and anti-war activity, there was a proliferation of committees to end the war in Vietnam, or CEWVs. They looked to the upcoming Thanksgiving conference as the first real opportunity to meet on a national level, compare notes, and chart future activity. The gathering was marked by a major dispute, one that was confusing to most of the people there. The form of the fight was over a seemingly simple organizational matter, but in the background loomed 2 entirely different perspectives for the future of the new movement. In reality, a fundamental question was involved: whether the anti-war movement would remain and grow as an independent force in American political life, or whether it would be channeled into Democratic Party politics, a graveyard for social protest movements. From the new independent anti-war committees had come a number of people, including many SWP and YSA members, who were interested in discussing the possibility of forming a national organization composed of committees standing for immediate withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. The NCC did not purport to be such an organization, its purpose being to coordinate activities of all sorts of organizations opposed to the war, most of which at that time favored calling for a negotiated settlement. The SWP and YSA did not propose eliminating the role of the NCC. They recognized a place for an organization that drew all opponents of the war together for common action, but they also saw a place in the coalition for a formation of independent committees favoring immediate withdrawal. A proposal to add a workshop to the conference agenda for participants interested in setting up such an organization was met by an almost hysterical response from the conference steering committee. To the thousands who have over the years attended subsequent national anti-war conferences, where the right to hold the workshop of one's choice was accepted as a matter of course, this may seem hard to believe. But the steering committee, in which the Communist Party had a major influence, steadfastly refused to allow a 13th workshop. Those upholding what they saw to be their democratic right to meet on a question of mutual interest were forced to hold a caucus to discuss the subject. Charges of Trotskyite splitters and wreckers were hurled left and right in order to obscure any rational discourse on the matter in dispute. The splitter and wrecker chorus continued for some time in several periodicals and in radical circles around the country. Among the most vocal was the Communist Party. Their perspective for the new movement was to send it out to ring doorbells for various Democratic Party PCE candidates. The Stalinist Data correctly saw a national organization of independent committees calling for immediate withdrawal as an obstacle to that goal. The CP's insistence on the negotiation slogan, which violated the right of the Vietnamese to settle their own affairs, was tied into their Democratic Party orientation, since it was a demand that many liberal Democratic candidates found acceptable. The political questions in dispute would be widely discussed in the coming months and years. Over time the anti-war movement would be one to support immediate withdrawal, the demand most in line with the needs of both the American and Vietnamese peoples. Supporters of an organization of independent committees favoring withdrawal were among the founders of the Student Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam in 1966. Without the eventual clarity over the course of the anti-war movement that resulted from the political fight that erupted at the Washington Conference, it is safe to say that this country would not have seen the mass movement that, combined with the heroic struggle of the Vietnamese, forced the United States out. The FBI, of course, was unable to get the SWP and YSA to pull out of the movement. Ignoring the advice of the FBI, the socialists discued and drew their own conclusions on the meaning of the conference. Among the most enlightening was the contribution made by SWP founder James P. Cannon before the Los Angeles branch of the SWP in December 1965. His remarks are also published in the publication mentioned above. The NCC conference marked the first head-on confrontation between the new generation of SWP members and the Communist Party. Cannon thought this was significant. Referring to the Bring the Troops Home Now slogan, he said, "I think our comrades were correct to adopt that slogan, and their militancy at the conference and their refusal to be bluffed or bulldozed is quite admirable. All the more so that they were perhaps taken by surprise and hadn't had previous experience with what the perfidy of Stalinism and the social democracy is really like. I will guarantee you that they will never be taken by surprise again. These are permanent receipts which speak well for the future," Cannon observed. He made an observation that seems even more true 10 years later. "Out of the anti-war movement I think we can see the beginnings of a new radical movement which raises great perspectives of world historical significance for America. It was not inevitable that a mass movement against the war in Vietnam would develop in this country. In fact, the life of the organized anti-war movement was characterized by frequent re-evaluations of perspectives. More than one questions of strategy were posed that had life and death implications for the movement. Their opponents within the anti-war movement would sometimes accuse members of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Young Socialist Alliance of posing limited imagination. This charge stemmed from the socialists' continuing insistence on mass demonstrations as the way to end the war. In the end, however, it turned out not to be the socialists who were short on imagination, but those who lacked confidence in the possibility of the American people taking to the streets in large numbers to demand an end to the war. It is now clear that the rulers of this country watched all this very closely. We have dire evidence that on at least several occasions the FBI sought to intervene in the political life of the movement in order to widen splits and to further trends that were harmful to the movement's development. From 1968 to 1970 the Indianapolis office of the FBI waged a 2-year campaign to destroy the anti-war movement, the YSA, and other radical groups at Indiana University in Bloomington. For this crusade the FBI created a newsletter called Armageddon News. Published surreptitiously over 2 semesters, the newsletter's purpose, according to the FBI, was to prevent any non-leftist students from being duped into joining the groups of the New Left. In a memo not reproduced in this book, the national headquarters told Indianapolis that the next issue, Volume 1, Number 2, and subsequent material must contain a more sophisticated approach with regards to the situation at Indiana University, and in relation to the broad protest movement in this country. Your leaflet should be prepared ostensibly by students who, while disagreeing with the Vietnam War policy and so forth, nevertheless deplore subversive elements on and off campus who are using these issues for their own purposes. Despite such efforts by Washington to edit it into an apparently liberal-leaning publication with some appeal to the students it was aimed at, Armageddon News came off as a right-wing scandal sheet, as the reproduction included in this chapter shows. According to former students at Indiana University, it had zero impact on the anti-war movement there. In addition to publishing and distributing the newsletter, the FBI infiltrated the YSA in Bloomington in order to bring about a split in philosophy and what it characterized as the only group on campus with a degree of organizational structure. In another case, in Atlanta, the FBI intervened in order to reopen a split that was in the process of being healed. The FBI feared that, after a period of disagreement in the local anti-war coalition, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, RYM, a split off from the Students for a Democratic Society, was going to cooperate with the YSA in organizing anti-war activities. To try to prevent this, the Atlanta FBI sent an anonymous letter to a RYM leader charging manipulation of RYM by the Trots. During August 1968, the FBI mailed out an anonymous leaflet purporting to be from a supporter of the Radical Organized Committee. The ROC was a short-lived organization formed by Communist Party members and others who, after unsuccessfully attempting to exclude members of the YSA from the national staff of the Student Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, themselves left the SMC. The leaflet praises those who split from the SMC and rebates the YSAFR committee packing and other high-handed crap so neatly done by the Trotskyites. At the center of this controversy were Kip Dawson and Sid Stapleton, 2 YSA members on the SMC staff who had become prominent anti-war leaders. Dawson now works as a printer, and Stapleton is National Secretary of the Political Rights Defense Fund, which is sponsoring the suit that pried loose the evidence of FBI intrigue. The militant discussed with them the 1968 dispute in light of the news about the FBI's role. The SMC had been established in the fall of 1966 by a variety of forces, among them members of the Young Socialist Alliance, radical pacifists, and members of the Communist Party and of its youth group at the time, the Dubois Clubs. The CP had from the beginning been a reluctant partner in the coalition, in part because its participation violated its traditional sectant taboo against working with Trotskyites. By 1968 the SMC had already established itself as a major organization, with chapters on many campuses. It had brought out thousands of young people on the day of the largest demonstration held up to that time, April 15, 1967. Where the CP was headed didn't come out in a clear way until the 1967 year-end SMC convention in Chicago, Stapleton remembered. They put forward a number of proposals that would have shifted the emphasis of the SMC away from the war. The effect would have been to turn it into a liberal youth group that dealt with many issues. During the approaching election campaign, such a group could easily swing into supporting liberal Democrats. Things didn't come to a head until after the successful SMC-sponsored student strike against the war in April 1968. The election pressure was building, and the Eugene McCarthy presidential campaign was beginning to attract some anti-war activists. At the same time, the United States opened peace talks with the Vietnamese in Paris as part of a move to defuse anti-war sentiment. Some opponents of the war thought negotiations would bring a rapid end to the fighting. A controversy broke out in the Working Committee, which was a semi-official body of SMC members living in New York, Dawson recalled. It was decided that no member of any political tendency or group would be allowed on the SMC staff. That meant Sid and I were fired. The anti-war movement had been based on non-exclusion, the idea that all opponents of the war were welcome regardless of their political affiliation. The Stalinists of the Communist Party defended this new step, which reversed that policy, in a variety of ways, often contradictory or illogical. For example, Mike Zagerl said YSers should be excluded because their work had succeeded in narrowing the coalition. What was really happening, of course, was that the CP was trying to transform the SMC into a support group for liberal Democratic PEA's candidates, as they were called. They needed to get rid of the YSA to make that possible. The Working Committee resolution was adopted with the backing of pacifists, the Communist Party, and their supporters, Stapleton said. They had a mechanical majority. This action brought a wave of protests from SMC members around the country. The CP and the rest of the exclusionists had OPE'd the fight on a narrow organizational level, with the political differences submerged. They continued this by refusing to schedule an SMC convention in the Midwest, which had been mandated by the previous SMC convention. Finally, an SMC Continuations Committee meeting was set in New York, the main base of the exclusionists. They had tried in every way imaginable to avoid an open political discussion of the issues, Dawson said. Now 400 people were gathered at the Continuations Committee meeting. The discussion was at last beginning. Suddenly, a 33-year-old public relations man named Art Goldberg, who had somehow gotten himself on the SMC Working Committee, jumped up on a table and shouted, "This is a Trotsky-emanated conference. All the independents are leaving." A minority began walking out chanting up against the wall. They were met by a counter-chant of "Bring the troops home now." The whole fight was summed up by the chants that came from two sides, Stapleton remarked. The FBI's leaflet was definitely in their style. The SMC went on to become bigger than ever. In the fall of 1969, and then in the spring of 1971, it was the co-organizer of the biggest anti-war demonstrations in American history. Its February 1970 conference drew almost 4,000. What happened to those who walked out? 60 of them met at a New York church to discuss what to do. As one of them aptly put it, although we all feel like brothers because we all hate the Trots, that isn't enough of a basis for a new organization. Phyllis Kalb of the CP summed up the mood there. "I'm against the YSA concept of mass demonstrations. I'm just tired of them." They finally decided to form the Radical Organizing Committee. "The last I heard of rock was during the demonstrations at the Democratic Party convention in Chicago that summer," Stapleton said. "I spotted 2 people paying out a rock leaflet." Stapleton recalled a later incident. "I was in Washington earlier this year at a picket line demanding an end to continued funding for the fighting in Vietnam. A person I didn't know walked up to me and said, 'I just wanted to let you know that you were right.'" "Right about what?" I asked. "You were right about the war in 1968, he replied. "You see, those of us who set up rock really thought the war was over. I thought it had ended and it was time to go on to other IOs. But it turned out you were correct." He was a high school student in 1968 who had gotten on into the fight, Stapleton continued. He is now a reader of the Militant. Immediately prior to the April 5, 1969, anti-war demonstrations, the FBI mailed out another leaflet to an unknown number of individuals and groups that were opposed to the war. Notes from the Sandcastle, as it was titled, red-baited the YSA and SWP and criticized them for failing to take on the pigs. Would such a leaflet have had any credibility? Unfortunately, it probably would, because in it the FBI advocated a viewpoint that enjoyed some support at the time, primarily in circles around Students for a Democratic Society. The anonymous author claimed to be a NSDS member. In the leaflet the FBI argued in favor of violent confrontations. The following June SDS would break up, and the strongest advocates of these tactics would become the weathermen. When the SDS National Council opened its March 28 to 30th meeting in Austin, Texas, that year, the 200 delegates and several hundred more observers were handed an open letter from the YSA. The central task of revolutionary youth right now, the YSA wrote, is to build the April 5 to 6 demonstrations against the war, as large and as militant as possible. This was precisely what YSA members around the country were doing. But the SDS gathering had what they considered to be more important business before them. The Austin meeting marked a turning point for SDS. For several years, the Progressive Labor Party, then the country's largest Maoist group, had been an increasingly important factor in the political life of SDS. With the deepening radicalization on campus, the grouping around the SDS national office was having more and more trouble responding to the political questions raised by the PLP. At Austin they were ready to unveil the weapon they hoped would meet the PLPE challenge. They unexpectedly emerged as full-fledged followers of Chairman Mao himself, and of Stalin too. It was really just about that simple. Why let the PLP have a monopoly on Mao Zedong thought? It was here that Robert Avakian, now leader of the Revolutionary Union, made his national debut as an exponent of Maoism. The same is true of SDS National Office member Mike Klinsky, today an officer of the October League. The Maoists have tried to portray themselves as the most ardent defenders of the Vietnamese Revolution. It is worth noting that in 2008 not only did they fail to endorse the April action, SDS did nothing at all about the war. Nevertheless, the demonstrations turned out to be quite significant and sizable. New York saw 100,000 march in the rain. There were 50,000 in San Francisco, 30,000 in Chicago, 4,000 in Atlanta, and more in other cities. They served notice on the ruling class that the American people were not taken in by the negotiations in Paris. Nixon's talk of an impending settlement was not going to get him off the hook. It is no exaggeration to say that it was the stubborn persistence of the SWP and YSA and others who agreed with them in arguing for the tactic of mass peaceful protests that kept the movement alive. Ultimately, the FBI and those that it serves were unable to hold the movement back from its goal. In the last chapter we saw some examples of the FBI's use of red baiting in the anti-war movement, smearing its targets as subversives, manipulators, or whatever else would appeal to the prejudices of the intended audience. The different varieties of this technique are such a mainstay of FBI sabotage that it is worth studying them in somewhat more detail. The documents on the following pages are concerned with 5 different Cointelpro operations. 4 involve the use of red baiting to disrupt the anti-war movement and the Black civil rights movement. The 5th operation was designed to intensify hostility between the Socialist Workers' Party and the Communist Party. The first set of documents includes an obscene, sexist leaflet, purportedly issued by an opponent of the war in Vietnam. This leaflet was mailed to a large number of anti-war activists. It calls for excluding the Young Socialist Alliance and the Socialist Workers' Party from the National Anti-War Coalition. Its purpose, in the FBI's words, was to cause disruption in the peace movement, primarily in the new Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam, and to minimize the growing influence of the SWP in the movement. The next selection from the FBI files involves an attempt to cause the NAACP to withdraw its endorsement of the Committee to Aid the Monroe Defendants, CAMD, in 1962. Another operation against the CA.MDIS described in Chapter 4. The national NAACP had not endorsed the CAMD, but some local chapters had. The FBI mailed an anonymous letter to NAACP Executive Secretary Roy Wilkins falsely charging that the CAMD was set up, dominated, and controlled by the Socialist Workers' Party. The letter insinuated, without offering a shred of evidence, that CAMD funds were being misused by the SWP. The third set of documents concerns the campaign of Sam Jordan, a black candidate for mayor of San Francisco in 1963. He ran independently of the Democratic Party, and the SWP extended support to his campaign. The FBI mailed an unsigned letter that, in their words, was ostensibly from a longshoreman who wants to vote for Jordan because of Jordan's strong stand for Negro rights, but the writer is concerned because of all the known Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, members who are running Jordan's campaign. Fourth is an anonymous memorandum from a member of THE National Steering Committee of the New Mobilization Committee, an anti-war coalition. The memo charges that the Trotskyists have seen fit to use the good offices of the NMC to further their own political aspirations, nebulous as they are. Finally, there is a 1962 directive from FBI headquarters in Washington to its New York office instructing them to try to stir up friction between the SWP and the Communist Party. The Worker, the newspaper reflecting the views of the Communist Party at that time, had recently run an advertisement containing the address of the New York SWP offices as a location to purchase tickets for a benefit for the Irish movement. The FBI telephoned the militant and the worker in order to provoke animosity around this ad. It is interesting to note, in the FBI's evaluation of this operation, that the militant editor did not rise to the bait. These documents do not, it should be remembered, tell the whole story. The FBI is refusing to turn over many of its files. We can assume that some of them contain information about more recent Cointelpro operations, such as those directed against the women's movement. Also, the FBI is refusing to release any documents or sections of documents that it claims reveal investigative techniques. Investigative techniques, we know, include bugging, wiretapping, mail tampering, and burglaries. The present documents have been censored to remove these unsavory aspects of FBI work. It is also well known that the FBI uses its undercover agents in various movements to encourage violence, disunity, and red-baiting attacks, but that is only hinted at here. These papers do prove that the FBI has found red-baiting to be one of its most effective weapons against struggles which the rulers of this country are out to destroy. The FBI uses red-baiting in two ways. The first is more familiar, and we have already seen some examples. Information is fed to newspaper columnists and politicians who are sympathetic to the FBI. For example, during the movement against the war in Vietnam, on the eve of a demonstration, some columnist or newspaper would suddenly reveal that socialists were active in organizing the demonstration. The purpose would be to create the impression that socialists were secretly controlling the action for their own ulterior motives. This was intended to scare people away from coming out to oppose the war. The Cointelpro papers contain examples of the FBI's use of the news media in this way. The documents reproduced in this chapter show the other way the FBI employs red-baiting. The message and the objective are the same. The difference is that the red-baiting seems to be coming from supporters of the black, anti-war, or labor movements. The FBI tries to initiate or encourage the exclusion of socialists, who are depicted as dishonest individuals who lack a sincere concern for the movement and are not to be trusted. The FBI's aim is to turn people away from fighting their enemy and toward fighting each other. Why did the FBI think it could get results with these methods? The reason is that anti-communist prejudices run very deep in this society. These prejudices have their roots in the anti-communist hysteria which began in the late 1940s and continued, although weakened, into the 1960s. The anti-communist witch hunt coincided with the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Americans were taught that communism was evil incarnate and that godless communists were out to rule the world. This was necessary to convince the American people to support massive war expenditures, along with wars like those in Korea and Vietnam, and maintain a huge standing army to act as world policemen for capitalism. At home, this campaign meant that socialists and communists had to be driven out of public life. Venal politicians like Nixon built political careers on the anti-communist issue. Members of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party, and other radical groups were thrown out of government jobs and out of the union movement. Pressure was put on black organizations to exclude socialists from their ranks. Hollywood churned out productions depicting Marxists as soulless agents of an alien force out to destroy America. If socialists or communists appeared to be working for some good cause, this was merely a clever trick to disguise their true aims and to win unsuspecting converts. A whole generation was weaned on this. But the rise of the black civil rights movement beginning in the late 50s and the mass anti-war movement of the 60s changed a lot of things. The rulers began to find that the communist menace was no longer sufficient to rouse Americans to die in Southeast Asia. Opponents of the Vietnam War learned that it was impossible to build a movement against a war that was justified by anti-communism while making concessions to anti-communist ideology within the movement itself. The principle of non-exclusion was established in the anti-war movement. Anyone could participate, be they Democrat, Republican, Communist, or Socialist, as long as they agreed with the goal of ending the war. Much to the dismay of the FBI, the old-style anti-communism of the 1950s lacked the power to destroy the anti-war movement. Columnists Roland Evans and Robert Novak could write on the eve of the April 24, 1971, anti-war demonstration that Socialist Workers' Party leader Fred Halstead was one of the central organizers of the action and have virtually no impact on the million people who turned out in Washington, D.C., and San Francisco. While this type of red baiting was becoming less and less useful, the FBI focused increasing attention on red baiting that was made to appear as if it came from within the movement. One of the reasons the FBI found this tactic so useful is that, unfortunately, some forces inside the movement engage in red baiting as a substitute for political discussion. This sometimes takes the form of charges that the SWP and YSA are opportunist. What people who make this accusation are insinuating is that socialists are not really interested in furthering, for example, the anti-racist struggle but are merely using it for some unspecified selfish end. Red baiting is almost invariably used in order to avoid or obscure a discussion of real political differences. A recent example occurred at the February 14 to 16, 1975, anti-racist conference in Boston. Some 2,000 people from across the country gathered to found a new organization, the National Student Coalition Against Racism. After a weekend of democratic discussion and debate, NSCAR voted overwhelmingly to help build the NAACP-initiated May 17 National March on Boston to support busing and desegregation of Boston schools. A group led by members of some Maoist sects tried to disrupt the conference by charging that the whole affair was dominant, manipulated, and controlled behind the scenes by the opportunists of the YSA and SWP. The disruptor delayed the conference for a while and finally decided to walk out. As they were leaving they said, "We demand an end to busing, an end to federal troops, and an end to this whole fucked up reactionary conference." Then it became clear for all TOSEE that their red baiting slanders were simply a cover for their political opposition to a movement in defense of busing, which was the entire purpose of the desegregation conference. Differences of opinion will arise in any healthy, living movement, and discussion of those political differences can only help make the movement stronger. Red baiting poisons the atmosphere and makes discussion impossible. It sows the seeds of suspicion and distrust. The FBI is well aware of this. These documents provide some important lessons. They show who benefits from red-baiting the FBI, the racists, and the reactionaries. And they show who loses: the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and other movements for social change. In 1968, the FBI took special pride in railroading Walter Elliott out of his hobby. As Scoutmaster of Troop 339 in Orange, New Jersey, the FBI reasoned that he posed a distinct threat to the goal of the scouting movement. Why? Walter Elliott was married to a socialist. In the view of the Bureau, this necessitated a Cointelpro operation to counteract his strong influence in shaping the minds of young boys. The agent in charge of the effort called Elliott's removal a successful application of the disruption program for a worthy cause. The FBI sanctimoniously claims a special duty to protect young minds. Protect them, that is, from ideas unpopular with the FBI. Teachers prove an obvious target with their strategic access to fertile young minds, as one memo put it. The Cointelpro files reprinted here show how this crusade to fire teacher activists dovetails with the FBI's relentless drive to harass and victimize the Socialist Workers' Party out of existence. The case of Evelyn Sell involves an interstate, interagency conspiracy against a preschool teacher described, even by the FBI, as an intelligent, excellent teacher who was well qualified in her field. The decision not to issue a new contract or consider the subject further for employment after the termination of her current contract is based upon information received from deleted the Austin Police Department. That is how the FBI summed up its efforts in a March 31, 1970, FBI memorandum captioned Evelyn Rose Sell, SMSWP, Subversive Matter Socialist Workers' Party. This security matter was in actuality an FBI vendetta against Sell, a head start teacher in Austin, Texas. The top secret information referred to is the fact that in 1968 Sell ran for public office in Michigan as an SWP candidate. This data was sniffed out by the FBI in Detroit at the request of the San Antonio office and was confidentially passed on to the Austin Police, who then tipped off the Austin Independent School District. School officials, with this information in hand, refused to renew Sell's contract at the end of the 1970 school year. Today, M.K. Hage, Jr., president of the Austin School Board, who served in that post when Evil Y.N. Sell was fired, says that the social climate was such that W.E. would fire anyone who was a socialist. In an interview, Evelyn Sell gave her side of the story. Before moving to Austin in the summer of 1969, Sell had taught in the Head Start program in Detroit for 4 years. She had helped organize a special unit of the Detroit Federation of Teachers encompassing the preschool program, and had been a delegate to the 1969 Michigan Federation of Teachers convention in the spring of that year. Sell's political beliefs were no secret. She joined the SWP in 1948 and had been active in socialist politics since then. She was nominated by the party several times as a candidate for public office. All my cards were on the table, says Sell. It was the FBI and the Austin School District officials who were underhanded and secretive. It wasn't until after the school district refused to renew her contract in 1970 that she became aware of the FBL's keen interest in her. The only indication before that time that the FBI was keeping tabs on her was an incident shortly after she moved to Austin. Her son Eric, then a student at Austin High School and an activist in the Student Mobilization Committee, was called into his principal's office. There he was informed that the FBI had paid the school a visit and had told the principal of his anti-war activities. The principal warned Eric that he was not to organize any anti-war activities at school, and then added that they were aware that his mother was a teacher. Eric came home and told me about his interrogation, and I said, well, the FBI must be in contact with my school, and I expected to hear something about it. But they never brought it out into the open. The fall of 1969 saw massive protests against the war, and Austin was no exception with its large university population. 11,000 marched to the state capitol for the October 15 moratorium. and organizing meetings on the campus would draw from 100 to 150 people. Sel was a consistent participant and organizer of these events. Did she connect her anti-war activity with the decision not to renew her contract in 1970? I suspect at the time that the FBI may have had something to do with it. The school used the excuse that the Head Start program, which had been administered by the school district, was no longer to be under its control. But I knew that was a phony excuse, Sel recalls. Texas had passed a law establishing a kindergarten system for the first time in its history, and they had very few qualified teachers. As a matter of fact, they were scrounging around trying to find teachers who had kindergarten endorsements. I was one of the few who had such an endorsement from the Texas Education Agency. And I asked to be retained by the school district to teach in the new kindergarten program. When Sel's contract was not renewed, she immediately applied to the new agency set up to direct the Head Start program, the Human Opportunities Corporation. She was accepted as an educational services supervisor. By early 1971 she had been promoted to director of the Child Development Program. The FBI files released on Sel end with the notation that Sel had been hired by the Hawk and that the information about her socialist activities would be furnished to that agency. What the files don't report is that the FBI streamed in and out of the Hawk offices, repeatedly visiting at least 3 of Sel's supervisors in an attempt to convince them that, qualified or not, this socialist did not deserve a job. One reason they offered was her active participation in the women's movement. Sel had played a leading role in organizing a demonstration in support of the right to abortion. The Hawk directors were outraged by the visits, Sel says. One of them told me that he was seriously considering filing a lawsuit against the FBI because of the harassing visits. The Hawk resisted the FBI pressure because they considered Sel an asset to the program. In her personal files, Sel has a letter from the Parents' Council of Head Start praising her for her work. It says in part, "We wish to commend Mrs. Evelyn Sel, for a job well done. The fairness and efficiency in her willingness to always make herself readily available if she could be of any help in any situation was quickly recognized." The emphasis is in the original. Sel left the Head Start program in January 1972, not because the FBI visits frightened or intimidated her, but because she was again to run for public office as a socialist in the 1972 elections. But I don't doubt that the FBI visits continued until the day I left, Sel comments. And they certainly continued past the April 1971 termination of the FBI Cointelpros. The Starsky case. Prominent in the ranks of teachers victimized the FBI is Morris Starsky. In 1970 the FBI encouraged Starsky's dismissal from his job as a professor of philosophy at Arizona State University. The Phoenix office of the FBI sent an anonymous letter slandering him to a faculty committee reviewing his teaching contract. In a memo dated May 31, 1968, the Phoenix FBI noted that L9CAL targets for Cointelpro were pretty obvious. It is apparent that new left organizations and activities in the Phoenix metropolitan area have received their inspiration and leadership almost exclusively from the members of the faculty in the Department of Philosophy at Arizona State University, ASU, chiefly Assistant Professor Morris J. Starsky. To that description of himself, Starsky adds that he helped organize the first anti-war teach-in at ASU, he led a campus free speech fight, he helped lead a successful campaign to win campus recognition for SDS, he participated in campus activities to support striking Tucson sanitation workers and a union organizing drive by Chicano laundry workers, he served as a presidential elector for the Socialist Workers' Party in 1968, he helped to re-establish the ASU chapter of the American Federation of Teachers, and he was the faculty advisor of the Young Socialist Alliance and the Student Mobilization Committee. All that provoked quite a furor among right-wing state legislators and university regents. The Faculty Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure, whose members received the FBI's slanderous letters, held 100 hours of public hearings on whether Starsky was entitled to teach at ASU. 3,000 students and over 250 professors signed petitions supporting Starsky's right to academic freedom. The committee's members were not duped by the FBI's anonymous slanders, although they expressed surprise 5 years later when they learned that a concerned alumnus was really J. Edgar Hoover. The committee voted unanimously against dismissing Starsky. But the regents refused to renew his contract and he lost his job in June 1970. Starsky says that it's sort of like being found innocent and executed anyway. Since ASUHE has lost 2 teaching jobs in California for political reasons. Starsky calls the FBI drive against him an attack on the rights of everyone. What teacher is safe? He asks. What ideas would not subject a teacher to this kind of attack? Only U.S. government-approved ideas. Starsky has spent the past 5 years fighting for his rights in and out of court. He has won 1 damage suit already. And an Arizona court ruled that the ASU action violated his civil rights. Meanwhile, the FBI refuses to turn over to Starsky some of its files on him on the grounds of national security. I've taught a couple of logic courses, he says, but I had a hard time figuring out how seeing my own files would harm national security. After I read the Cointelpro documents it became clear, national security means the FBI's security from the nation finding out the vicious things it does in violation of people's civil liberties. More poison pen letters. FBI schemes to get 2 other teachers fired are documented here. Unlike the Sell and Starsky cases, these efforts did not have the results the FBI wanted. In 1969 the Detroit office received approval from Washington to send a series of letters on Professor David Harrishoff to Michigan State Senator Robert Huber. Huber was chairman of a legislative committee investigating student dissent on state campuses. The letters were signed a fed-up taxpayer. They document 17 years of Harrishoff's political activity from 1951, when he was a student at the University of Minnesota, through 1968, while he was a member of the faculty at Wayne State University. Compiled from public source material to ensure the FBI could not be identified as the letter's source, the information was intended to make a case for ridding Wayne State of Harrishoff's peculiar influence. Harrishoff's disruptive activities apparently included a debate with a former FBI agent in 1951 on the topic, "Does the FBI menace civil liberties?" His participation in the University of Minnesota Socialist Club, which spearheaded a campaign in 1955 to remove campus restrictions on outside SPE.acres, an HIS election to the Detroit Executive Board of the American Civil Liberties Union. Harrishoff says that he is happy that everything charged against me in the FBI denunciation is true. Harrishoff recalls that during the debate with the FBI agent he accused the agency of breaking the law every day in the week. That was back in 1951. I guess the FBI never forgets an insult. Harrishoff says he doesn't believe the FBI will ever change and it ought to be abolished. Wouldn't abolishing the FBI be a fitting observation of the bicentennial of the Revolution? In still another poison pen episode, the FBI tried in April 1969 to get Maud White, now Wilkinson, separated from her employment as a preschool teacher in Washington, D.C. The local FBI sent an anonymous letter signed a concerned citizen, purporting to be from Wilkinson's neighbor, to the superintendent of the D.C. school system. The letter said that Miss White has held weekly meetings of a socialist youth group in her apartment. After expounding upon the classical FBI distortions of the YSA as a group supporting violent activities against established authority, the letter continues, "I bring this information to your attention in order to protect the D.C. school system from the menace of a teacher who does not have the interests of the children or the country at heart." But it was precisely the interests of the children and the American people that led Wilkinson to become a socialist. Being a teacher, especially in the D.C. schools, I saw how rotten the schools were, how much money was spent on war and how little on education, she says. Wilkinson's files also document the three-way collusion between the FBI, the intelligence unit of the Washington police, and the school administration. According to an FBI memo, one local cop was delegated responsibility for conducting intelligence investigations within the D.C. school system at the direction of the Assistant Superintendent of Schools in charge of personnel. Information on Wilkinson compiled by the D.C. police was forwarded to the FBI. The response from teachers. The revelation of such attacks on teachers has evoked an outraged response from educators and civil libertarians alike. Professor William Van Alstyne, president of the American Association of University Professors, demanded that the agents responsible for the sleazy and surreptitious campaigns against Morris Starsky be fired. Delegates to the 1975 National Convention of the AAUP gave the former Prof. BSOR a warm welcome and voted to support high efforts to defend academic freedom. Local chapters of the AAUP and the American Federation of Teachers co-sponsored many of Starsky's speaking engagements during a nationwide tour he conducted in the spring of 1975 to win support for the SWP suit. Publications with large circulations among educators, including Higher Education Daily, Chronicle of Higher Education, the AAUP's Academe, and the AFT American Teacher, printed articles criticizing the Cointelpro attacks. At the 1975 National Convention of the 1.7 million member National Education Association, Executive Secretary Terry Herndon condemned the FBI's operations as reminiscent of the witch hunts during the McCarthy era, noting that nowhere does the FBI charge that any one of its targets was not a good teacher. Herndon asked a question that must be on many people's minds: while only a few such cases have surfaced thus far, we cannot help wondering how many more teachers were beset or harassed because of counterproductive surreptitious activity by the FBI into the private lives of educators. The NEO leader added, "Such efforts to get teachers fired only make the job of teaching about democracy and government that much harder." The head of Maud Wilkinson's chapter of the NEO summed it up well. In a telephone interview, John Radcliffe told of his immediate response to the Cointelpro operations. "As soon as I found out about the situation," Radcliffe said, "I called the school district and told them that we, acting as the union, would absolutely and categorically not tolerate anyone messing with Maud's job." Radcliffe has no doubt that the FBI is continuing its efforts to get people with dissident views fired. But he thinks that the political climate has changed and that the FBI doesn't have such an easy time of it today. "As far as Maud's job goes in Fairfax County, it's secure," Radcliffe concluded. "She can belong to any political party she wants to." Peter Camejo and Sid Stapleton walked into NBC's Washington studios at 6:15 on the morning of March 19, 1975. At 7 a.m. the Today Show went on the air. A few minutes later millions of Americans first learned of the FBI's conspiracy to destroy the Socialist Workers' Party. Readers of the New York Times who had picked up that day's paper when it hit the street the night before were the first to find out about the story. The main headline was about the CIA's multi-million-dollar operation to retrieve a Soviet submarine off the floor of the Pacific. But also on the front page was an account of the FBI's Cointelpro plot against the socialists. Peter Camejo is the SWP's presidential candidate. Sid Stapleton is National Secretary of the Political Rights Defense Fund. After their appearance on the Today program, they drove to a news conference. There the PRDF released copies of the Cointelpro papers and individual FBI files on several SWP members. Soon after the Washington news conference, reporters dispatched stories about the contents of the FBI files to newspapers and television and radio stations across the country. That evening and the next morning millions more learned about the FBI plot against their democratic rights. In the following weeks the PRDF amassed some 600 newspaper clippings on this story. While this hardly compared to the deluge of publicity surrounding the Watergate scandal, it did represent an important breakthrough in alerting the American people to the systematic crimes of the federal spy agencies. The coverage in the major NE_WS media, reaching tens of millions of people, included the following. A March 19 Associated Press dispatch was carried in 170 daily papers in 37 states. It was front-page news in 50 papers. The New York Times ran a detailed page-one story, plus a background article on the SWP. The Times story was picked up by at least 25 dailies. The AP sent out 5 separate follow-up articles. United Press International distributed 2 different stories. The Washington Post carried a page-one article. It's more difficult to measure the response on radio and television, although most Americans rely on them for news. The Today interview was the most significant. Every single major paper carried at least one story on the documents, said Kathy Perkins of the PRDF National Staff. The press treated the story very seriously. They saw the FBI behavior revealed in the documents as clearly illegal. I believe our assertion that these sorts of things are still going on after the FBI's alleged 1971 cut-off date for the program was accepted. The charge that Cointelpro continues whatever it's now called is central to the suit. The front page of the March 20 Houston Chronicle carried a big headline about Dan Fine's FBI file. He had been the SWP's candidate for mayor in the previous election. Newspapers in Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, and Wisconsin ran stories about illegal FBI activity in their areas. The Los Angeles Times sent a staff writer to Arizona to report on what happened to Morris Starsky, the Cointelpro victim who was fired from his teaching position at Arizona State University. The reporter called FBI headquarters in Washington to ask why the FBI had launched this attack on Starsky and the SWP. The FBI refused to comment. But, interestingly, they did send him a copy of red-baiting remarks inserted into the congressional record by Representative Larry McDonald, a leading member of the John Birch Society. A good many of the files involved attacks on the Black civil rights movement. Several North Carolina papers printed stories on an operation in that state. One of the AP stories, which concerned the North Carolina incident, was featured in papers throughout the South. New York City's major black paper, the Amsterdam News, ran a front-page story on FBI attempts to block collaboration between the NAACP and socialists. Syndicated black political commentator Chuck Stone wrote about how the new interest in Marxism among some blacks relates to the FBI assault on the SWP. The Guild Reporter, put out by the Newspaper Guild, described how the FBI misused the press. The Militant has provided the most thorough coverage by far of the Cointelpro story with several news articles and a 12-part Cointelpro Papers series. Others reporting the story included important papers in several different countries, campus papers, Liberation News Service, Rights Magazine, and alternative newspapers in many cities. 3 months later, on June 24, the PRDF turned over to the news media a new group of files coughed up by the FBI. Again, it was big news. The major national news sources AP, UPI, the New York Times, the Washington Post all featured stories. Sid Stapleton appeared on the network CBS Morning News. The release of the documents rated banner headlines in the Houston Chronicle, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and the Washington Star, all papers in cities where FBI dirty work was uncovered. Stories on other local Cointelpro plots unmasked by the files were featured in newspapers in St. Louis, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Detroit, Kalamazoo and Muskegon, Michigan, Indianapolis, Portland, and Austin. Some of these stories were in time reprinted in other cities. Muhammad Spex covered an Atlanta PRDF news conference where it was revealed that the FBI worked with the Atlanta Constitution to red-bait the YSA and the anti-war movement in that city in 1968. The Constitution was the only paper to suggest the FBI files might be forgeries. Perhaps more revealing than the level of news coverage was the amount and character of editorial comment. The PRDF has received editorials on the first set of files alone from a total of 36 newspapers. Several columnists commented in one way or another on the release of the Cointelpro papers. Included were nationally syndicated columnists Nicholas von Hoffman, Mary McGrore, Tom Wicker, Arthur Hoppe, and Patrick Owens. James Wexler, an editor of The New York Post, devoted 2 of his daily columns to the subject, and Village Voice columnist Nat Hentoff mentioned it. Conservative political commentator James J. Kilpatrick chose the topic for remarks broadcast nationwide on the CBS radio network. Taken together, this media response presents an illuminating picture of the current controversy around the role of the FBI. The first thing that stands out is that nowhere is there any attempt at all to defend the Cointelpro conspiracy. On the contrary, it comes in for scathing criticism. To the list of organized crime operations, add the FBI. Thoroughly illegal Dayton, Ohio, Daily News. Tactics ranging from the bizarre to the despicable Des Moines, Iowa, Register. Frightening, chilling Philadelphia Inquirer. Illegal and unconstitutional Niagara Falls, New York, Gazette. Gutter tactics Ogdensburg, New York, Advance News. Gestapo tactics St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It reads a lot like lies and libel. Like a mixture of the late Joseph McCarthy and the worst of Watergate. Bruce Morton, CBS Morning News. Kilpatrick's remarks over CBS Radio must have articulated the feelings of many who share his political views. I hope to remain a friend of the Bureau, but the disclosure of the FBI's outrageous and contemptible harassment of the Socialist Workers' Party is enough to put a crimp in any friendship. Many observers have noted the SWP's legality, a legal American political party. Not accused of violating any laws. St. Paul Pioneer Press. Views never were shown to be subversive or in any way endangering freedom in our democracy. Blade, Toledo, Ohio. Perfectly lawful American political party, entitled to exist alongside the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Charleston, West Virginia, Gazette Mail. Legal political party. Minneapolis Star. Conspicuously absent for the most part is any tone of old-fashioned red baiting. As the Scranton, Pennsylvania, Times saw it, their sin in the eyes of J. Edgar Hoover was believing that a brand of socialism would be better economically and politically for the United States than the present system. After making points like those, many observers went out of their way to insert some disparaging remark about the SWP. A couple of editorials described the SWP as minuscule. The F.B.1's appetite for very small potatoes was the headline on Nicholas Horrock's analysis in the Sunday New York Times. On the one hand, these writers think the FBI is urgently in need of a facelifting to recapture its authority, and this is their way of putting the FBI down for what they see as wasting time and money. But it isn't very surprising that the SWP is described in this way. The party is small by most standards. Certainly, in terms of American political parties where the capitalist Democratic and Republican parties monopolize the scene, the SWP seems irrelevant to most commentators. Some were no doubt genuinely confused about why the FBI paid so much attention to the SWP and YSA. It was a sign of J. Edgar Hoover's paranoia, concluded a few. J. Edgar Hoover, in any case, is not central to the issue. There is ample evidence that Cointelpro-type operations continue after his death. But for all his idiosyncrasies, he was a devoted servant of the ruling class. His job was to run a political police force, one that was cloaked in secrecy, and he did just that for 50 years. It's dirty work. Most people believe that in a democracy there is not really supposed to be a secret police. Cointelpro, as a matter of fact, was never meant to be known to the American people. That's why Hoover made a big display of canceling the program after it came to light in 1971. The Cointelpro papers and the other files reveal some stupid FBI blunders and misestimates. The total picture, however, is of cool, calculating technicians, not crazed paranoids, going about the business of secretly combating people who are challenging the rule of the rich. That's the FBI's job. The American ruling class is very far-sighted. Although socialism is still relatively uninfluential in the political life of this country, that is not true on a world scale. The rulers realize this. They foresee a potential socialist challenge here. They study the history of past American radicalizations in which socialists have been prominent. They can also see more clearly than many media commentators that socialists have had some role in current social struggles. In an interview with Newsday, Peter Camejo put it this way. Hoover realized you can't judge a movement only by numbers. He realized that the party was a catalyst in the anti-war movement. Break us and you've broken the back of the anti-war movement, is the way he reasoned it. All the big newspapers and television and radio networks are. Editorial, Friday, October 10, 1975. Enough is enough. The official position of TJ1E Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice and the Bureau's counterintelligence program, Cointelpro, is that it was foolish, misguided and sometimes illegal, and that it was ended in April 197 Yet, according to FBL documents recently obtained by TJ1E Socialist Workers' Party in a JAV suit against the BU. RIA, some Cointelpro techniques / are being employed at least as late as December 1973. 1B documents show that after April 1971, the Bureau continued to contact members of the Socialist Workers' Party and its youth affiliate Tulmphone then, or the Bureau's knowledge or their political activities, and then to seek more information about those activities. The Bureau also continued to contact members of the organization by telephone to gain personal information about them under the pretext of doing a jury duty survey. Such methods are used on at least 34 occasions after the program was supposedly ended. The Socialist Workers' Party is a legal and one-American political organization. Although it has been the subject of wiretaps on ELANS for 30 years, no indictments and no convictions have been obtained by the government. The only conceivable purpose of the continuation of the Cointelpro techniques is harassment and disruption of legitimate political activity. Attorney General Levi Bulletin recently expressed his high rationale for the FBI and has characterized some recent criticism of the organization as unfounded. The criticism might fade more quickly if it were clear to the Bureau that disruption of legitimate political activity is not part of its N1 mandate, and if it could be demonstrated to the American people that when the government says it has terminated a course of improper conduct, it actually has done so. Owned by wealthy capitalists. They have an interest in how the dispute over the FBI and CIA is resolved. Commentary in the news media is a reflection of a Disco 88 ion now going on in ruling circles. There is wide agreement that both the FBI and CIA need a new coat of paint. That is the goal of the current investigations. The New York Times has urged the slumbering FBI oversight committees in Congress to develop some clear new rules of conduct for the Bureau. Writing in the Saturday Review, former CIA official Tom Braden predicted, various committees now investigating the agency will doubtless find error. They will recommend change, they will reshuffle. But they will leave the monster intact. At the same time, the investigations carry a certain overhead. They can lead to uncovering new scandals that compound the problem of restoring credibility to the institutions. That's what is now happening with the new discoveries of CIA AS-88 in-at-ions and FBI burglaries. New FBI Director Clarence Kelly has already taken steps to improve the agency's image. He has given frequent news conferences and interviews, something Hoover shied away from. Local FBI offices, which have always refused to talk to the media, have been sending agents for special training in public relations. The socialist suit raises more substantial questions than the FBL's image. It calls for a halt not only to Cointelpro-style harassment but to political surveillance. A short-lived victory was won in December 1974 when a federal judge banned FBI spying at the YSA's annual convention. The temporary ruling was later substantially weakened by Supreme Court Ju. Stice Thurgood Marshall. No responsible government official now advocates a total ban on electronic surveillance, The New York Times's Horrocks wrote. That remains true. None of the editorials came out and squarely condemned spying. A couple of papers explicitly endorsed it. The problem was that the FBI went beyond keeping an eye on the group. Atlanta Journal. In an article on the congressional investigations into the FBI, Horrocks found that the FBI has been far less criticized for investigations leading to prosecutions than it was for its so-called counterintelligence program. Attorney General Edward Levi offered a rather half-hearted criticism of Cointelpro. He labeled the operation foolish because it doesn't work very well and outrageous because I think there's enough dishonesty and lack of candor and incivility in our society as it is. FBI Director Kelly hasn't even gone that far. In fact, he openly defended Cointelpro at a news conference. It was meant to do something that would ultimately benefit the nation, he said. A retired FBI official, former Assistant Director William A. Sullivan, was even more forthright in his endorsement of the conspiracy. On July 6, 1975, he appeared with Kelly's blessings on CBS TV's Face the Nation. A reporter asked about the anti-SWP Cointelpro. Sullivan was forced to admit that the SWP had done nothing illegal. We have no evidence to this date that I know of that they've ever been involved in any violent activities, he said. Then why is the FBI so interested in the SWP? This group advocates the overthrow of the United States government by force and violence. That is patently false. The SWP has replied to that slanderous allegation in answers to government questions submitted to the court in conjunction with the suit. Sullivan endorsed sending letters to employers to get SWP members fired. The only mistake that I think that we make in an instance like that was sending an anonymous letter and not signing J. Edgar Hoover's name to it. I think we owe the American people this type of information. In an earlier interview with the campus newspaper the University of California at Los Angeles, Sullivan was asked if there is any law that allows the FBI to expose communists. He said he knew of none. But, he added, there is not any that I know of that say that we should not do this either. Sullivan also told the UCLA paper that communists are not entitled to equal protection under the law and are not entitled under the First Amendment to have private political associations. An indication of the government's likely defense for its assault on the SWP can be seen in Larry McDonald's red-baiting tirades in the Congressional Record. McDonald unsuccessfully tries to link the SWP with foreign terrorist groups. The Birchite claims his information comes from his own personal research, but it has all the earmarks of FBI intelligence. What has been accomplished? What are the gains of the suit to date? In the first place, there is no reason to think that the information on FBI and CIA illegal activity made public so far would have ever seen the light of day without the initiative of the suit. For example, CIA files released through the suit show the agency spied on the SWP since 1950, while the official Rockefeller Commission report said CIA domestic surveillance began only in the late 60s. These revelations have helped educate the American people about the anti-democratic way the employing class maintains its rule. The resulting public outrage has helped put the FBI and the CIA on the defensive. Exposure of their operations, and potential exposure, in the current political climate makes the dirty work of these agencies much harder. The socialist legal action has pushed Cointelpro to the center of the debate around the FBI. Under this pressure, top government officials today insist that Cointelpro is over and done with. They say J. Edgar Hoover ended it on April 28, 1971. The date is significant. April 6, 1971, was the day that news reports of a break-in at the FBL's office in Media, Pennsylvania, shattered the secrecy surrounding the operation. All available evidence argues convincingly that Cointelpro-style disruption and harassment continue. Even the FBI memos that Ed Hibley discontinued Cointelpro are unmistakably worded to allow the agency to engage in future disruption. These files are reprinted in the introduction to this book. Evidence in the socialist suit includes scores of post-1971 Cointelpro-EDL incidents. The evidence indicates that the FBI got socialists fired from their jobs and thrown out of their apartments, tried to disrupt their personal lives, and attempted to pressure them into being informers. The purpose of the suit is to defend the democratic rights of socialists and all working people. Already the exposures of these illegal actions and the response have begun to do that. There is more to the story than what the FBI has admitted thus far. Cointelpro itself, massive as i.e., only part of the FBL's secret war on the SWP and the YSA and on others trying to change society. There are indications that the FBI undertook disruption actions before 1956 when Cointelpro began. Even during its so-called Cointelpro years the agency engaged in similar actions outside of that program and instead called them investigative activity or racial matter or subversive matter. The Cointelpro papers are still rigidly censored. The FBI maintains a right to keep secret information that the agency says might blow the cover of informers or investigative methods. Even the congressional committees investigating the FBI have had difficulty getting access to agency material. As Time magazine has said, it seems unlikely that courts will force agencies to release information that would compromise FBI methods. But the efforts of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Young Socialist Alliance, and others continue. We can expect further progress in the battle to get out the full story and to put a stop to the FBI's crimes.